It was 2019. I lived in a house with two other girls. We were all in our early 20s. The house backed into a park. It was more like an open lot that was accessible through a main road. There wasn't any playground or barbecue area there, just long thick grass and trees. The backyard fence was only about waist high, and there was a tree on the right-hand side, obstructing about half of the view over the fence into the park. One night after I showered and got into my underwear and a baggy shirt, because it was summer, I hear the dog in the backyard going absolutely mad. My housemate was not home at the time, and the dog belonged to her. I fly out of the back door and see that he's baring his teeth and snarling toward the fence. He had caught and killed possums before, so I was concerned that there was one by the tree. I grabbed him by the collar to get him back inside and away from the possum. As I did, I got a shiver and a sense that something wasn't right. He was still going ballistic, and I looked up and saw a figure standing in the dark just on the other side of the fence. It was a man who was about 5'10", and he didn't say anything. I couldn't see his face. I naturally jump and say, "Oh my goodness, I didn't even see you there." The man did not reply. He just stood there in his beanie and jacket, staring at me. I kept the dog in front of me as I backed into the house. Once inside, I locked up everything and closed all the windows, and I called my partner to come over. A few small things happened over the next few months, but nothing that really stood out. There was a popped security screen, and we found some computer parts in the lawn that could have been discarded by kids or something. One night, I get home after having drinks and dinner with some friends. It was late, around 10 p.m. We often left the back door open to let the dog come in and out. We always just kind of assumed that the dog would scare away anyone from breaking in. How naive. When I got into the kitchen, which was next to the back door, I hear the dog barking in the backyard. Again, this has happened many times before, so I ignore it and make myself a drink before going out there and bringing him back inside. I then see a shadow move to my right, inside the f***ing house, rounding the corner from the back door into the kitchen. I froze. I then think to myself, what on earth is this man doing? It's summer, and he's in a long coat covering his entire neck to his wrists. And then panic set in. I back myself up to the counter and looked down to see that there was a knife in his hand. It was one of our kitchen knives from the block behind me. So now I'm aware he has already been inside this house. This wasn't a robbery. He had already had the chance to steal anything he wanted. There was a scuffle, and he pulled the rug from under my feet, and I hit my head on the counter. I was knocked unconscious. The last thing I remember is the dog barking from behind him. It turns out our scary dog was too afraid to attack him, but he was still doing his best to scare him away. The police and detectives eventually came, but there wasn't anything that they could do, because technically there was no breaking and entering, since our back door was left wide open. This also meant that it would be difficult to determine what he touched. I also seem to remember that he was wearing gloves, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I did have defensive wounds to my hands and some bruising, but overall I was fine. It could have been a lot worse. Nothing ever came of this. The police suggested that we lock our back door from now on and hope nothing like this would ever happen again. I can't be sure if it was the man I saw by our back fence. Around this time, we had a third housemate. One day she asked me for a cigarette because she was stressed out about something. I told her that I didn't smoke, and then she suggested that it must be our other housemate. Confused, I said, "What are you talking about? Neither of us smoke." Apparently, she had been picking up cigarette butts from outside the front and side doors of our house for her entire stay. She never said anything about it because she decided it was something that bothered her, but clearly not us, so she didn't mind cleaning them up. She would leave very early in the morning for work, before either of us woke up, which is why we never saw them. This is going to be kind of long, so please bear with me. So this happened when I was in high school and still living with my parents and my younger brother in a house in the suburbs. The area I grew up in was very quiet and safe. We lived in the Midwest, and our town was as Midwest as you can get, which means that everyone knew each other. Even the strangers were very kind and eager to help, with some exceptions, of course. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where every third house had the same exact layout, which means everyone was pretty much living on an equal level. For the most part, everyone got along pretty well, and there was hardly any crime since everyone was coming from a similar financial background. So it would be an understatement to say that it felt very safe where I lived. That was until strange things began to happen. At first, it was small things, pretty inconsequential in the moment, but now when I look back at everything, I always made a connection to the strange events that were going on. It started at the beginning of my junior year of high school. One morning I woke up early to put away my clothes. Because I'm weird about these kind of things, I make sure all my dressers and doors were closed before I left, as I was the last one out of the house, and I happened to have a doctor's appointment on that day. I was the first one back. When I came up to my room, my door wasn't closed all the way, and my closet was completely open. I thought it was weird, but I brushed it off. But this happened more than once. I would sometimes be missing shirts or pants after I told myself that I was just being stupid and probably misplaced them somewhere. Another night, after I had gone to bed, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. The fifth step always creaked very loudly, and when I heard that, I instantly sat up. I remember it clearly because I could hear it over my fan. After the footsteps stopped, I checked every room upstairs. All of the bedrooms were on the second floor. All the doors were closed and everyone else was sleeping. All of the doors creak pretty loudly when they're opened in the night, so I would have heard something since I was the only one who slept with their door open. I couldn't see much. Everyone was sound asleep. I stayed awake for a while to try to catch it again, but I eventually fell asleep, figuring that my mind was just playing tricks on me. I asked my family about it casually the next morning, but everyone said they slept through the night. All of these small occurrences accumulated into one of the weirdest experiences I've had to date. It was halfway through the year, and I had driven myself and my brother home from high school. I threw down my bags on the dining room table and laid down on the couch to watch some TV. My brother went downstairs to take the dog out and then play some video games. I could tell by the fact that there were no other cars in the garage that my parents were still at work. So I put the volume on medium so I could hear them when they got back. My parents used to give me a lot of crap for watching TV after school. Everything was fine, and I actually began dozing off when I heard a very distinct thumping sound coming from upstairs. I thought it was just my imagination. I watch a lot of horror films, so I tend to be pretty jumpy sometimes. I went back to my show, but the thumping continued for about 5 minutes. That's when I finally decided that something was off. I muted the TV and listened for a few more minutes. It was a rhythmic thumping, and it was coming from directly upstairs. For a second, I thought it was just my dog, since he sometimes paced up and down the stairs, trying to find somewhere to lay down. So I called out for him, but my brother shouted that he was downstairs with him. So I walked up the stairs to the top and listened. The noise was coming from directly above me. I started to get scared when I realized that the only thing above me was the attic. And furthermore, I realized that it wasn't thumping that I was hearing. It was footsteps, like somebody was wearing boots and pacing around the attic. Even though I was thinking the worst, I told myself to be practical. There are only 2 entrances to the attic, a small panel in the ceiling of my brother's bedroom, and a 3rd-story window. I checked his bedroom, and the panel looked like it hadn't been touched in a very long time. We hadn't even opened it since we moved in, because the previous owners told us it was just insulation and wiring. I then thought about how we were having trouble recently with our satellite dish, and my dad had to call a repairman to come fix it. I opened the front door and went around back, but there wasn't anything on the roof. Not that I could see anyway. It was pretty high up. I then went back inside. My brother was standing in the doorway, asking me what was going on, since he heard the door open. I told him about what I heard and asked him to come check it out with me, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. When we got upstairs, he gets this weird look on his face and then asked, "What is that?" I felt relieved knowing it wasn't just me. I whispered, "It sounds like somebody is walking up there, right?" He nods and points downstairs, suggesting that we say no more and I should follow him down there. The floors are pretty thin in this house, so in case there was somebody up there, we would want to talk about this out of earshot. Once we were downstairs, I tell him about the roof and the possibility of a repairman being up there, although I didn't see a van outside, and my brother shakes his head, saying that the repair people were coming later that week. That's when we decided to call our dad. I explained everything to him. I could tell that he didn't believe us, but was trying to be nice about it. I can't exactly blame him. It was highly improbable for somebody to even want to be in our attic, let alone get up there. He suggested it might have been a bird or a raccoon. We lived near a large patch of woods. I tried explaining to him that no animal could make that kind of thumping sound. If it was a bird, it would have had to have been repeatedly slamming itself into the floor. And even then, that wouldn't explain how the floor was creaking, like somebody was shifting their weight. He said just to wait it out, and that he would be home soon. The thumping continued for well over 30 minutes. I decided to camp out in my brother's room until it stopped. After about 15 minutes, I had to use the restroom. There's one right next to his room, and is still under the attic. As I was washing my hands, I realized that the thumping was a lot louder now, and directly above me. It was weird because before, the thumping was loud when I was in my brother's room. It was like the sound had followed me. Sometimes when I get really scared, I get super angry. So I banged twice on the ceiling. I'm a pretty tall girl, so I used my fist. I then shouted, "What the f*** is this?" The steps then completely stopped. I was confused for a second. Then clear as day, there were 2 loud thuds. Like someone stomping their foot twice very loud. I ran out of the bathroom to my brother, who was coming up the stairs. What just happened? The pacing started again, so I quickly explained everything to my brother. He then pulled out his phone and called my dad a second time. As he's trying to explain everything, I can tell that my dad is still not giving in, frustrated and frightened. I take the phone from my brother, put my dad on speaker, and hold the phone up to the attic, then say, "Listen to this." Suddenly, all the noises completely stop. Absolutely no sound whatsoever. After about a minute of silence, I hear my dad say, "What sound?" My brother and I just look at each other and bolt down the stairs. I tell my dad to come home quick and that we would wait downstairs for him. He then said that he was pulling up the driveway, so we opened the door and ran out to him. After my brother and I explained things quickly and nearly out of breath, to my dad's credit, we did sound a bit insane. He follows us upstairs to where the sound was coming from. But now, there was absolutely no sound at all. And even though we beg him several times to go take a look, he laughs and says that we're just overreacting, and there was nothing there. Taking out the panel might cause some damage to the ceiling. We don't know that for sure because we've never tried to look up there, so he was pretty set on not going up there to check things out, unless he hears it himself. Of course, the steps never came back, at least not when we were around or awake. My brother secretly stayed in my room for a couple of days, because he was still freaked out about the whole thing, and we were never able to prove what happened to our parents. When the repair people finally did come, I noticed that instead of using a ladder, they went around to our backyard and climbed up to the roof from our deck. They were also able to walk around pretty freely up there and could easily access the window to our attic, which was around the front of the house. I've always wondered if there was someone secretly living up there and would come down at night without us knowing. But if that was the case, why would they let us know that they were up there that day? It still bothers me that we never checked. My name is Caleb Fletcher. I'm 16 years old, and the story that I'm about to tell is something that I'll never forget. This took place on the 24th of August. School had been going on for about 2 weeks, so to decompress, I decided to see if my friends Griffin and Broly wanted to hop on Fortnite. My mom and sister were out shopping, and my dad was working, so I was pretty bored. It was around 8 p.m. when we finally got online to play. After a few rounds, I could tell that my friends were getting tired of losing, so they logged off after about an hour. I planned on just lying down with my phone before going to bed. That was until I heard my 2 dogs barking outside. It's not that unusual for them to bark, given how people walk on the side of the road outside of our front yard. But I still looked anyway. You can never be too careful these days. I didn't see anyone there, but seconds after I looked out of the window, I heard our garage door opening and then closing. That usually meant my dad was home from work. However, I thought it was odd that I didn't see his van outside, and he had even texted me earlier, letting me know that he would be working late. I decided to walk downstairs into the dining room to get a better look. From there, I could see that the driveway was empty. At first I thought, oh shit, could it be a ghost? For context, someone had died on our property many years ago when there used to be a gas station here. Apparently an old man put too much air into his tire and it exploded. Now, I'm not the type to go investigate strange noises in the night, so I ran back up to my bedroom and texted my family group chat to ask if anybody was home. I told my mom about the garage door. and she told me to turn off all the lights, lock my bedroom door, and stay in there until she got home. So I did just that. About 15 minutes later, I thought I heard the wooden floorboards downstairs creaking, like somebody was trying to sneak around. I didn't have anything to use as a weapon, so I unclipped my microphone's boom arm from my desk and quietly opened my door. I walked onto the upstairs balcony and looked over, trying to see if I could spot anyone hiding or anything suspicious. I then stupidly called out, "Is anyone there?" As if somebody was actually going to answer me. For a second, I thought I was just being paranoid about this whole thing, until I saw the silhouette of someone standing beneath the balcony. I panicked and ran to the closest room, which happened to be the small bathroom beside my room. The intruder must have known that I saw him, because I heard loud footsteps coming up our stairs as I locked myself inside. I was cursing under my breath that I had accidentally left my phone in my bedroom. After hearing nothing for several minutes, I finally built up enough courage and bolted out of the bathroom into my bedroom, locking the door as soon as I got in. My sister's room was right across from mine, and I noticed that her door was open. So I figured that's where the intruder must have gone. After locking myself in my bedroom, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But just before I hit the call button, I noticed that the door to the storage room was slightly ajar. I then saw an eyeball peeking through the crevice. That's when it hit me. The intruder was not in my sister's room. He was here, with me. The terror I felt rushing through my body is something that I will never forget. True, genuine fear. I ran out of the bedroom and booked it down the stairs and out my front door. I then ran up the hill to my neighbor's house, who happened to be a police officer. I told him about the intruder hiding in my bedroom, and he immediately alerted the police. Then he set out to go investigate himself, while I stayed behind with his wife. Minutes later, I ran back down to see if the intruder had been caught. When I entered my house, I saw a tall, skinny man I had never seen before. He had a gray beard and a dirty black coat. He was on the ground, being handcuffed by my neighbor. Ever since that night, I'm no longer allowed to be home alone anymore, and we have upgraded our security around the house now. My family is just happy that I wasn't hurt and are very thankful for my neighbor's bravery. I don't wish an experience like this on anyone, not even my worst enemy.
My name is Jim, and I've spent a lot, and I mean a lot, of time on the road as a trucker. Ever since trucking school, I've been driving long distances for hours every day, and even with benefits, the pay wasn't the best. While it did pay enough to financially support me and my wife, the stress it had on top of me was unbearable. Being in a truck for hours at a time really forced you to make sacrifices. Once in a while, I'd miss out on family events like birthdays and even holidays, which didn't feel good at all. On top of that, America is in desperate need for truckers to keep up with demand, which made the situation even worse. I drive for about 12 hours a day, and we couldn't stop for any reason until we reached our destination. Needless to say, I barely had any time with family. One night, I was doing my nightly routine of driving to a warehousing complex to deliver some products for major retail businesses like Target and Best Buy. I was somewhere in a rural area of Wisconsin on this long, empty road that stretched across the state. It's around 6 a.m. and I'm sipping my coffee trying to keep myself awake. Being a full-time trucker, caffeine was your best friend. If you didn't have it, you were in trouble. So there I am, driving down this road trying to keep myself awake when I see something big walk across the road from my headlights. I yell out an "oh shit" while practically slamming my brakes, coming to a complete stop. All the while, I'm cussing to myself, thinking that I just hit a person or possibly a bear. Going back, at first I did think it was a person, but then I remembered that whatever it was massive. 9 feet tall, a bulky body, and the movement it was walking looked abnormal. I step outside of the truck with my gun in hand, going to where I saw it. To my surprise, however, there was seemingly nobody on this road. Nobody walking, no roadkill, no nothing. The only thing I did see was faint tire marks on the road from me hitting the brakes too hard. I call out for anybody who might have been nearby, but got no response other than the sound of wind picking up and the truck engine. I get back inside and continue my route, managing to finish it within a few hours, but couldn't get what I had just seen off my mind. Later that same day, I call up one of my other fellow truckers and tell him about what I had just seen on the road. It turns out that he had experienced things that were similar and that it was likely a hallucination given that I was tired. Thankfully, I have a camera that sits next to the interior and was thankfully able to capture a brief second of this creature before it went out of frame. The photo will be on screen now. As you can see, the camera quality isn't that great, but it was likely due to the condensation on the front windshield. Because it was a single road with forest on opposite sides, there was a pretty good chance that it was an animal. My only question is what kind of animal 9 feet tall walks on 2 legs? I don't know if it was a person, I don't know if it was Bigfoot. One thing I do know was that I wasn't imagining it. My name is Sarah, and this happened to me a few years ago when I was a sophomore in college. I attended school in one of the most quiet and safest cities in the country. The people were nice, the crime was low, and sirens would almost never be heard. Because of this, I never really had any unsettling encounters. However, little did I know that would all change in just one night. It was late November of 2021, and my friends and I had decided to go out to a bar to celebrate getting through finals. While the city did have low crime, it was also known to have a lot of bars and pubs. This resulted in a lot of bar fights where cops would be called. Anyway, my friends and I are at the bar taking shots and having a blast. The feeling of relief you get when finishing finals was amazing. At around 1 a.m., I told my friends that I had to go as I had to finish packing to fly back home the next day. However, they wanted to stay behind and finish their drinks, so I said my proper goodbyes and stumbled out of the bar. Because I was nearly drunk at this point, I went on my phone and decided to order an Uber back to my dorm. Thankfully, one accepted my ride request almost immediately, which wasn't common seeing that it was late. I sit down on the outside bench when I see a car pull up and someone waving their arm out. Even in my drunken state, I assumed that this had to be my Uber, even though the app showed he was still 4 minutes away. I brushed it off, assuming it was a glitch in the app, and got into the car. The very second I get into the car, I immediately noticed the red flags. For one, he didn't even say my name, and 2, he never greeted me. But it was late, and I was simply too tired to care and just told him my address. As I'm in the car, I also noticed that he never put the address into his GPS, which I found odd. Figuring he must have known the area well, I let him do his thing while I just kinda kept to myself. I'd try asking him questions to make small talk, but he'd just reply with one-word answers. It eventually came to a point where I didn't even bother talking to him anymore. At one point, I look out the window and realize he was going in the complete opposite direction of my campus.
Hi, sir. My college is in the other direction.
I see him glance at the rearview mirror while giving me a nod as if he had acknowledged or understood me. However, he didn't turn around and just kept driving until he eventually pulled over beside an old office building. That was when I slowly came back to reality and knew what was going on when I start panicking. The fake Uber driver gets out and tells me to stay put while he goes around the building. I have no idea who or what he was going to get, but whatever it was definitely wasn't good. I grab my cell phone and see that I had several missed calls and messages from the real Uber driver. I knew I didn't have a lot of time, so I slowly open the door and start running while trying to keep my balance. There weren't many people in this part of the city, so I ran into a nearby shop that was still open where I called the cops. I'd say within a few minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the office building, but the car that was there was gone. They questioned me and made sure I described the car's description in perfect detail. I'm still unsure if they ever found the car or not, but I'd like to think that they did. A month after this incident, I saw a chilling news report about a couple who had gone missing getting into a car they thought was their Uber. The boyfriend's body was found 20 plus miles away. The girlfriend survived even after suffering from severe bruises. The news said it was someone they apparently knew, but I've always wondered about that. As of now, the car has never officially been found, and the driver has never been identified. For a little bit of context, this happened on July 4th of 2019. I had just started doing both Uber and Lyft as a side hustle to make some extra money for my boyfriend and I. It wasn't the best paying job, but flexibility was through the roof, and you didn't have people telling you what to do. It's a chill and steady job, but you always had to stay on top of what you were doing. Anyway, it was the 4th of July, and I decided to do some Ubering as I knew there would be a lot of people out. Every 4th of July, my city hosts this annual music festival where thousands of people attend, so I was guaranteed to get a few people. Almost immediately, I kept getting requests left and right as people exited the venue. I decided to choose one, and within a few minutes I see a man walk up to my car. He asked if I was his Uber, to which I replied with a yes. He gets in the back seat, and right away, the strong smell of marijuana hit me like a brick. However, I knew that he had just come from the festival where smoking was bound to happen, so I wasn't complaining. Throughout the ride, this guy just stared intently at me, as if he were watching my every move. I'll be honest, it kind of made me uncomfortable, and I just wanted to get this ride over with. At one point, he stops staring at me and gets out his phone to call someone. I just tried to focus on driving, and his destination was only 10 minutes away, which was a relief in my book. As I'm driving, I hear him in the back speaking French. Now, my aunt is French, so while I understand a fair bit of French, I don't speak it. So I hear him talking, but I don't pay attention as it's rude to eavesdrop on people's conversations. That was until he said something along the lines of, "This girl I'm riding with." I felt my blood run cold as he said this, but tried to make it seem like I didn't understand him. What he was saying was unnerving. To sum it all up, he was basically saying after I had dropped him off, he was planning on, quote, snatching me up. I knew exactly what that meant, and his stop was only 5 minutes away, so I didn't have much time. I'm a 5'3" petite girl that weighs about 150 pounds. This guy was at least over 6 feet and was muscular, so there was no way I could resist him even if I tried. With very little time to spare, I get out my phone to call my boyfriend. My actual plan was to cause a scene and make up an excuse to leave. As I'm driving, I call him and ask what was up, where I immediately say, "Wait, what? She's bleeding on the floor? Tell her to stay calm, I'm coming." All the while, my boyfriend is completely confused, asking what I was talking about, etc. Thankfully, I used to be in acting school, so I was used to faking a good scene. At that point, I hung up, turned to the man, and said in a worried tone,
Sir, my grandma just hurt herself. I have to go. I'm just gonna drop you off here.
I floored it down the road before calling my boyfriend back and apologizing, telling him everything. I ended up reporting the man to Uber, but I'm not sure if they investigated it as of yet. Thank you to my boyfriend for picking up, and thank you to my aunt for teaching me French.
In this wonderful modern time, we have the luxury of ordering just about any food we want for delivery. It's easy to get anything from pizza to a chicken sandwich. On the flip side, we can take jobs as delivery drivers and make a few bucks on the side. It's easy work, and when you're a single mother like me, any extra income is good income. A few weeks ago, I delivered some food to a nice suburban community. It was one of those neighborhoods you'd see on a Disney Channel show. Nice houses, picket fences, you know the neighborhoods I'm talking about. And like all the deliveries I make, I'm supposed to take a picture of the food at the front door. Think of it as like an insurance policy in case the food is at the wrong house or stolen or something weird happens. I place the food in front of the door, on top of the small staircase that leads to the door. I took a few steps back and took a picture of it. After taking the picture, I was walking back to my car when I was confronted by an extremely angry and enraged woman who came out from the house across the street. I asked her what her problem was, and she just kept screaming at me, saying that it was private property and that I was trespassing. I tried explaining one time to the woman what I did and why I took the picture, and it did not compute in her tiny little brain. After being continuously cut off every time I tried to speak, I decided to just get into my car and drive away. I tried being nice, but clearly this woman was insane. I got inside my car and was checking my phone for another delivery. The woman started to bang on the hood of my car, causing me to jump from being startled. I got out of the car aggressively to see if there was any damage, and she ran back to her house. There was no damage, but I was so done with this delivery and I decided to just call it a night. I ended up driving home and spending the evening with my daughter. We ate dinner, played some games, and watched a movie together. I put her to bed and started binge-watching one of my favorite shows, and I would have guessed that it was around midnight when I heard someone knocking at my front door, knocking rather aggressively, I might add. I couldn't believe what I was looking at through the peephole in the door. It was the crazy woman from the delivery earlier in the day. I didn't answer. I didn't even say anything. I just kept watching this woman, trying to figure out what she was doing at my house. She had to have followed me home, which was already insanely creepy, and while I was watching her, she went over to the walkway that led to my front door. From the driveway, I have this path of little stones that leads to the front door. It's not like big slabs of pavement, but rather small stones that almost fit together like a mosaic. The woman grabbed one of the stones, roughly the size of an average dinner plate, and put it behind her back. She started to knock on the door again, still concealing the stone behind her back. And this is where things get very weird. I didn't answer the door, but I shouted to her that I had called the police. And this must have scared her because she threw the stone at my house and ran away. I did end up calling the police and reporting what happened. They followed up, but nothing really came of it, and that was the end of the story until recently. If that was all that happened, that would be scary enough, not knowing what she wanted from me and her showing up in the middle of the night. But things got much worse. About a week after the incident, I saw the woman at the grocery store. No confrontation or anything like that, but then I saw her several other times just driving. Again, no confrontation or anything else. I wanted to say it was just a coincidence, but It almost felt a little too weird. I have a friend who is married to a cop, and I talked to him about it. I explained that something felt off, but it's possible that it was just pure chance that I kept noticing her, and he agreed. He basically said that because I'm aware of this woman, I'm subconsciously picking her out of the crowd in our town. I didn't like that answer, but I guess technically he was right. It is a pretty smallish town after all. And this brings me to about a week ago as of me writing this account. I just got my daughter on the bus and I was outside pulling some weeds. While I was on the ground, I could feel someone standing over me. I turned around, and it was that woman. The same damn woman from that stupid delivery. I was completely vulnerable in that position and I didn't know what to do. And she said in a sort of soft but angry voice, "You're a monster for calling the cops. You're a trespasser." I noticed that she had one of my stones again, and without thinking, flight mode kicked in, and I got up and ran as fast as I could. She actually tried hitting me with a stone, but she missed. I ran inside and locked the door. I called the police and told them that she was back and trying to hit me with a rock. The police showed up, and this time, they arrested that crazy woman. It turns out that that woman had some pre-existing history of mental health. I'm not exactly sure what it was. And because this is so fresh, I don't exactly know what happened to her. I saw her get taken away in the back of a squad car because she was still at my house when the police came. And I just hope this nightmare is over. At least for now, it seems to be over. I just hope that she gets the help that she needs and that I never have to see her crazy face again. In my early 20s, I had a knack for spending more money than I could afford. When I got my first real taste of making money, it's not an understatement to say that I was reckless. One of the first things I did was get a new car with extremely high payments. Instead of leasing a smaller, cheaper car, I decided that I was going to buy a BMW. It's not a top-of-the-line one, but still a BMW, and my payments were over $600 a month, which may not seem like a lot for some people, but for me, it was crippling. I barely made enough money to pay my bills, and I still lived with my parents at the time, and so I found myself doing all sorts of tasks for friends and family members to make some extra money. I regularly watched my friend Dom's dog. Dom had to go out of state every other weekend for his job, and since he didn't have a wife or girlfriend, he had me as his dog sitter. And I did this for about 6 months and honestly loved the job. He lived in a nice and quiet neighborhood. The dog, Willard, was a golden retriever and was such a good dog, not to mention easy to care for. And these bi-monthly trips to Dom's were something I looked forward to. But like most good things in the world, it eventually came to an end. I'm sorry about the pessimistic attitude, but the last time I watched Willard, the evening started like every other weekend dog-sitter trip. We'd play in the yard for a while, go for a walk, and then wind down at around 9 p.m. One of the reasons why Dom trusted me was because he knew I could never have people over or anything like that because I would work early in the mornings on the weekends. Usually I would be asleep around 10, but on this Saturday night, I was invested in a movie that ended a little after 11. The movie was Inception, just in case you were wondering. And after the movie, I let Willard out while I got myself ready for bed. I always felt weird about sleeping in Dom's bedroom, so I would usually sleep on the couch with the dog. Just as I was getting comfortable, the doorbell rang. I looked at the clock and it was about 11:16 p.m. My mind immediately went to someone in Dom's family. I couldn't imagine anybody else ringing the doorbell in his neighborhood at this hour, and I rushed to the door, and standing on the other side was a young man, most likely in his early 20s like me. He looked clean-cut and didn't have a threatening presence about him, and I opened the front door but kept the outer screen door shut and locked. And talking through the screen, I asked him if I could help him with something, and he didn't seem weird or sketchy, and in a very confident voice he said to me, "Hey man, I got the food you ordered." And 2 things I feel like I need to mention here. 1, this was before all the food ordering apps, so your food never just got dropped off at the door. You had to physically go and pay for the food at the door and have an interaction with the delivery driver. And 2, you're probably assuming that Willard is like most dogs and that she's barking like crazy at someone ringing the doorbell. Well, she isn't like most dogs. Not only did she not bark, but she stayed on the living room couch the entire time I had an interaction with that delivery driver. I was kind of annoyed by this more than anything. I definitely wasn't scared. I mean, why would I be? I had no reason to believe that this was anything other than just some mistake. I explained to the guy that he had the wrong address and that I didn't order any food. We had a quick back and forth, and then we figured out that the delivery was for a different address and he accidentally went to the wrong house. The guy started to apologize and I told him not to worry. While he was apologizing, I noticed that his car was filled with 3 other people, 2 in the back and 1 in the passenger seat. I thought that was pretty weird. I never noticed delivery drivers have anyone else in the car with them, let alone an entire carload of people. We finally wrapped up our conversation and locked the door. I made my way back to the living room and tried to get myself comfortable again, and I was a little annoyed, but I understood accidents do happen. Not 2 minutes later, the doorbell starts ringing like crazy. You know that annoying sound of the bell just ringing non-stop? Well, I jumped up and ran to the door. It was the delivery driver, and now he looked a little bit more panicked. I didn't open the front door but shouted through the window beside the door. I asked what he wanted, and he told me that he accidentally hit my car in the driveway while he was trying to leave. And before I could answer, he put his head down and said in an almost ashamed voice, "I'm sorry, man, but it looks like there's a little damage. I hate to bother you, but I think you should take a look." Now I was furious. I opened the front door and started following the delivery driver down the driveway toward my car. I didn't even put shoes on. Several feet from the car, I noticed something strange, though. His car, which was filled with passengers just a few minutes ago, was now empty. I stopped abruptly, and the delivery driver told me to keep going, and that the damage was on the other side of the car. It may have taken a while, but finally I started to get the feeling that something just wasn't right. I told him that I wanted to go back inside and grab my shoes. I started to walk back to the door, trying to pretend that everything was fine, and just a few steps into my walk back, I heard a noise to my right. From the brush on the side of Dom's house, 2 people emerged wearing hoods. I started to jog towards the front door. On the other side of the house, another person started to run full pelt at me, and at that point I began sprinting toward the door. I was inches from the house and one of the men tried to tackle me. Thankfully, he was just far enough away that he made contact with my ankle, but it wasn't enough to trip me up. I freaked out, got inside, and locked the door behind me. That tackler was immediately at the front door, banging and trying to open it. I was able to get a glimpse of the man who tried tackling me. He looked like he was tan, a skinny guy with a buzzed hair. He had a scruffy beard and a tattoo of some tiger on his neck. I grabbed my phone and called the police right away. I stared out the window while I was speaking with the dispatcher, and I saw all 4 of them standing near my car. I told dispatch what had happened and gave them a very detailed description of the delivery driver and the tiger tattoo man, and I watched all 4 men get into the car and drive away. I was able to tell the police that it was a red Honda Civic, and the police eventually showed up and took my entire statement. But what's frustrating for me is that even with all the details I gave the police, they never caught any of these dudes. But what's most frustrating is that I have no idea why I was targeted. I didn't recognize these guys, and when I told Dom about the incident, the appearance didn't sound familiar to him either. It's scary what can happen out there in the world when you least expect it.
So my aunts were out of town for a couple of weeks, and they trusted me to be home alone. They didn't have anything to worry about. I'm not the partying type. I just like to go to work at a local store in my hometown, go out to eat, get cleaned up, and go to bed. That was my usual routine. That night I decided to stay in, and I ordered some pizza. I just didn't think that this much trouble could arise from something so mundane as ordering pizza. So I called in my order, and it didn't take very long for them to get to my house. I looked to make sure it was the delivery guy, and I was thankfully correct, though he was kinda creepy. I went out and signed for it. The man looked at me though, and began to ask me some creepy, personal questions. Questions like, "How old are you?" and "Are you here alone?" I used to live around creepy guys like this when I was a child, and I knew how to answer them. I told him to just have a good night. I began to turn around with my order when I heard him say something else. "By the way, you look really good in your work uniform." I just pretended to smile, and I walked back into my house. I locked the door, and I had an anxiety attack. I didn't see him for a week after that incident, but when I was walking home, I saw him looking around the store, and I hurried out of there. But he followed me, and he said hi. I smiled and waved at him, then kept walking. Yet he kept following me, so I kept looking behind, keeping an eye on him. I walked into a gas station that I always stopped in after work. The manager there knew me very well. I told him the situation, and he told the man to leave me alone before we had a problem. But the manager of the gas station told me what the guy had said back to him, and that's the scariest part. The guy just smiled before walking away. He said, nothing to worry about. I'll have her alone soon." Luckily, nothing more has happened since then, but I have my guard up, ready for anything. At least, I hope I'm ready. I'm a 20-something guy living in the middle of Tennessee. Before this bizarre experience, I'd been going to college full-time to be a paralegal. One day, though, my mother broke her hip after falling down the stairs. She was 52 at the time, and my dad had passed a long time ago, so it was on me to take care of her. We didn't really have anyone else. I was forced to make myself a part-time student, because I would have to get a job to help her afford some of her medical bills. At the time, thanks to my late dad, I had a fairly new car, and I figured it'd be fun and easy to deliver pizza. I loved to drive. Where I lived, there was a lot of scenery, and sometimes I even went on drives just for the sake of it. As you can probably guess, it was easy to get the job. I just applied at a few local places and called each of them the next day. Before I knew it, I was delivering pizzas wearing a Domino's hat. Delivering pizza wasn't hard. I can be completely honest with you about that. But delivering can be insanely stressful. You've got to get there at a reasonable time. You keep hoping that the order was made correctly, because you can't just send it back to the kitchen when you're miles away from the restaurant. And last but not least, you find yourself praying that your next customer isn't a prank or a complete jerk. I can't tell you how many jerks I've delivered to. Jerks who didn't want to pay because I wasn't able to give them one more pack of Parmesan cheese. Well, there came a day when I had to deliver a large pizza to an address I did not recognize. The place was about 10 miles away from the restaurant in an area we all infamously called the Boondocks. It was an area that I'd personally never been to, but when I saw it on my drive, I would describe it as a country region of town where there's only a single trashy house every 5 minutes on the road. And I'm not trying to be rude. These places looked beat up, old, and ransacked. It was honestly hard to believe that people still lived in those places. I was fully expecting at any moment to witness a drug deal, or to have someone step out in front of my car to stop me and try to sell me meth. Needless to say, it was a bit of a creepy place. Given that it was getting dark out fast, I was ready to get the delivery over with. I arrived at the customer's address rather quickly, thank God. Luckily, this house was far cleaner than all the ones previous. It was a small white home with a short paved driveway and a seemingly untouched screen door in the front. The yard was well kept and clean, and the grass looked to have been cut recently. Also, there were no cars in the driveway, but I still assumed someone was home to pick up the order. I got out hesitantly and I grabbed the pizza. The carrier was still hot enough to burn my skin if I held it in one spot for too long. This was good, It was probably our most common complaint we got, that our pizzas were too cold or not hot enough when we dropped them off. So that was one thing I didn't have to worry about. With some flimsy confidence, I began to walk up to the screen door. When I was nearly at the porch, I could now see a faint light through the front window, and that's when I saw the silhouette of someone looking out at me. Someone standing there, watching me walk up to their door. Good, I thought. This will be quick. I made it to the front door, cleared my throat for whatever reason, opened the screen door, then knocked on the wooden door. With the first knock, the door slid open. The door hadn't been closed at all, so when I knocked, it opened further. But I swear, there's no way it should have opened that much from a single light knock, because the door in a matter of seconds was wide open. I could now see inside. I could see the faint lighting from what appeared to be 2 dim lamps in the living room. I could also see a small, maybe 28-inch TV in the living room, displaying a silent, flat blue screen. For several seconds, I didn't realize that I was holding my breath. I could feel goosebumps coming up on my forearms. What in the world was going on here? Hello? I said. It definitely wasn't loud enough to get anyone's attention though, so instead, without stepping through the doorway, I knocked on the open door, hoping to let someone know that I was here. I waited for at least 2 minutes, but I didn't hear a soul. Nobody walking or talking in the house. No sign that anyone lived there. I stood there, frozen and silent, trying to listen. "Behind you," a voice whispered. I felt breath on the back of my neck, cold, chilling breath. Immediately I spun around. I did it so quickly that I dropped the pizza inside its carrier, but I didn't care. I ran back to my car and was ready to peel out of there. But I made the mistake of looking back at that dang house. I saw it in the window. The silhouette of a person standing there, still watching me. Except now, they were waving. I hauled tail out of there. When I made it back to the restaurant, I was written up for failure to deliver and for losing my pizza carrier. I thought I was going to be fired, to be honest with you, but I think my manager just went easy on me, as she knew the situation with my mother. On one of my rare days off, one of the days I didn't have to work or take care of my mom or go to school, I went back to that strange neighborhood. I found that house again, but it took me a while to be sure that the place I was looking at was really the same place. Because even though it had been about 2 weeks since the incident, the place was a wreck. The screen door was hanging off of its hinges with holes in the screen. The white paint on the outside was now an off-white or nearly yellow, with patches of chipped paint, and the lawn was now a jungle with random auto parts scattered about. I gathered my courage and drove back to the nearest neighbor I could find. I knocked on their door and excused my intrusion. Then I asked them if they knew anything about the strange house. To my surprise, they did. The house was the home of an old man who struggled with his drinking. Apparently, he drove his kids away from frequent abuse, and once those kids left his life for good, he took a shotgun and ended his own life. I was covered with chills as I listened to the story. It was like some sort of ghost story you'd see on TV or hear from an urban legend, but this was real. I'd lived through it. After the man told me that house hadn't had electricity on for the past year, I thanked him for the information and I bid him good day. I stopped delivering for Domino's after that. I didn't feel like delivering to any more strange places, and I got a better job offer as a manager at a local Subway. Still, sometimes I get a chill on the back of my neck, and I can't help but think about that voice saying, "Behind you."
I'll be the first to admit that I used to be a major asshole. I used to make a living as an armed robber. No joke. And I was mostly targeting big chains with cash that was on site. This is sort of a confession. Their employees never gave a crap to really do anything, whereas you rob a mom and pop shop and you tend to get less mom and more pop, 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 if you know what I mean. I'm trying to make light of it, but either way, I robbed places because I was addicted to heroin. I did just about anything and everything I could get my hands on, but my main thing was H, and to get it, I had to roll with some pretty terrible people. It wasn't so bad if I was around my home turf. I knew the right places to go and the right people to talk to. But whenever I was off on business, which tended to be frequent as you don't want to poop where you eat, as they say, I had to attach myself to certain other folks if I wanted to get what I needed. And I mean it, man. I rolled with some very scary dudes back in the day, but none as scary as Tyran and Lash DeFore. The one and only time I met one of them was when I was down in Georgia, running drugs for some biker gang down there. The DeFores used to make this really killer meth, military-grade shit, but they only ever sold in bulk from this compound that they had out in the sticks, and they only ever met you in this one place, away from their cookhouse so no one could find it. It was hard to get a hold of them, even harder to put an order in for a shipment, as they usually sold everything to this group of guys down in Florida to keep their profile low. But this one time, I get told to drive out to that drop site and wait until either Tyran or Lash showed up with the shipment. And so, I drive out to the place, wait there a while, and then this big shirtless dude comes walking out of the woods carrying a backpack. The dude is covered in tattoos with what looked like a really bad hair dye job, but what I later learned was the fumes from him cooking so much bleaching his hair. Anyway, he walks up, looking like I'm something that he found on his shoe, and we make the exchange before he starts asking about people that I'd never even heard of. And the dude was completely whacked out on something, because he kept staring at me in confusion whenever I'd say, "Dude, I don't know who you're talking about here, sorry." He seemed mad at first, like I was lying to him or something, but then on his last name he just started laughing as if to be like, "Whatever, dude." And after that he walked off back into the woods to wherever the hell his compound was, and I drove back to the shop to drop the shipment and collect my payment. A couple of hours later, I'm linking up with a buddy of mine to score some H when I start telling him about the creepy spacey dude that I met out in the woods. The second I get to telling him about this guy's tattoos, he starts asking if I knew the guy's name. Then when I told him it was either Tyran or Lash, he starts making faces as if to say, "Hot damn, you just walked into the lion's den and only got out again by the grace of God." And my buddy then goes about telling me about everything he knows about the Dufour brothers, and everything he'd heard anyway. So these Dufour brothers lived out there in the woods in some hidden compound that they'd built with their own hands, completely off the grid. It was just a lab, cookhouse at first, and all the necessary equipment, but I guess they got sick of driving to and from all the time, and decided to just live out there full time so they could work whatever they wanted to, day or not, without any interruptions whatsoever. And according to the guy I hooked up afterwards to score some H with, the way the Dufour brothers guaranteed no interruptions was to booby-trap the surrounding area with the kinds of stuff that you only see in Vietnam movies. Spike pits, swing and trigger traps, and they even had tripwire grenades strung up in the trees where only Lash or Tyran could see them. I was told that every so often a deer would trigger one of the traps, and that mostly that's how they got their food. But to keep the people at bay, the Dufours had to get a little more creative. The devil traps, I heard them called bird traps too, they look like those little stickmen things from the Blair Witch movie. I don't know how creepy people would find them these days, that movie's 25 years old now, but they sure would have worked on anyone who'd seen that movie. I remember listening to all that and thinking, Sure, they sound dangerous, but at least they just want to be left alone. Well, the Dufour brothers did want to be left alone, but only during working hours. The trouble was, they weren't exactly the men-about-town types. Both had multiple warrants, so they couldn't exactly stroll into town for a few cocktails without cops throwing their butts in jail. So instead of going to the party, the Dufours brought the party to them. And they were swimming in cash. Crystal, they sold LSD, so they used to get a whole bunch of girls out there to spend a few days with them whenever they wanted to party. Professionals, you know what I'm saying? They were there to smoke bowls and get paid, but they always got way, way more than they bargained for. No girl ever went twice. They wouldn't. They had to get these new girls in, ignorant ones, or ones who knew that they could spend a few days getting high as a kite, if they could only put up with Tyran and Lash's proclivities, I'll just say. My buddy said that he didn't know exactly what they used to get up to, but that he had heard from one girl that the Dufour brothers liked scaring girls that they had delivered to him. They used to dose him up with a bunch of drugs, and then do all kinds of things to him, try to make them lose their minds. I heard some really weren't ever the same again, and that some of them disappeared afterwards, wanting to get as far away from the Dufour brothers as possible. I heard they were into some weird religious stuff out there too, something like Santeria, but probably a lot more like devil worship by the sounds of it. Supposedly, Lash and Tyran used to get high as hell, light fires, cut the heads off of animals they trapped, and then drink the blood in these messed up, meth-fueled ritual-type binges. They had all kinds of old books lying around on witchcraft and Satanism and how you can, open up portals with your mind if you think on it real hard. All kinds of crazy crap like that. I think Lash had all sorts of devil tattoos too. Like it wasn't just a style thing for him. They really believed it. I mean, they always said those boys were crazy. And with all the drugs and crystal meth out there, I can believe they smoked themselves onto another freaking planet. Another time, someone had to go back to their compound for some reason, and after avoiding all the booby traps and all of that, they found Lash Dufour had a friend with him. Whoever it was hadn't seen this new friend around before, which was weird because it was usually only people they really trusted that ever saw the compound, and he'd been working with them for a year by then, so that was to be expected. But then, to see this young-looking kid, maybe 19 or 20, sitting there all whacked out looking like he was having a bad trip, that gave our visitor all kinds of bad vibes, especially when he saw how Lash was messing with him. The kid didn't seem like he was having fun at all, and he even got up and tried to get away. Lash just started laughing, tripped the kid up, and then threw him back on their outdoor couch before telling him to stay put. Lash was always messing with people like that, I mean. He loved doing it with hookers, and he'd do it with his friends, too. And the only thing was, the kid's face was on the news for weeks afterwards. He went missing, and never showed up again. Then there was this one time these two guys tried screwing the Dufour brothers over. Very sly, too, slipping them a few fake bills into a stack. Anyway, it didn't slip by them. But instead of going after him and taking what was theirs up front, the Dufour brothers pretended not to notice. They went along with it, really made the guys that they were selling to, making them think that they were idiots. And then one day, the boys invite their business partners over for a few drinks and no one ever sees them again. I heard Tyran still talks about their skulls, like he gets all messed up on whatever they got over there and then just stares at them, laughing sometimes like they're telling him jokes that no one else can hear. After my buddy finishes telling me about the Dufour brothers, I think about every hair on my body was stood up on end, knowing I'd avoided a similar fate to some of the other poor folks that had made it out near their compound. Made me real glad that I only ever had to deal with them that one time, because get on those boys' bad side and I don't think I'd ever gone anywhere near the state of Georgia ever again. There's some real psychos out there in the world, and the less time you spend around them, the better. I grew up in this one-horse town out in Kansas. My parents owned a small general store but still struggled to make ends meet. Whenever I wasn't at school or playing over at a friend's house, I used to hang out at the store and do odd jobs for my parents. Nothing that'd break any child labor laws, just odds and ends to keep me occupied. One day I remember this guy turning up to the store, kind of weird looking, and the way he looked at me made me not want to be around him. He'd stop by every so often, and whenever he did, I always tried to stay away from him. But this one time, while he was browsing, my dad stepped into the back, and I was alone with the creepy customer for a minute or two. I remember walking to another aisle which towered over me at that age and trying to stay out of that guy's sight, but I remember standing there, then seeing him lean around the corner of the shelf like one of those velociraptors in Jurassic Park with that big smile on his face. I think I was too nervous to just run off, or maybe just not quite scared enough. But I remember standing there, trying not to look at him, and he came closer and kneeled down beside me. When he said hello, I had no choice but to look at him. I remember thinking that he was going to ask my name and really not wanting to tell him. But instead of asking me anything, he just told me how special I was. It was super weird, because I remember going from thinking that he was a creep to thinking, maybe this guy isn't so bad after all. But then, what he said next I just found confusing. He told me, "Little ladies like you are the most precious thing in the whole wide world," he said. "And the key to everything is right inside here." And as he said that last part, he poked my tummy, soft with one finger. I wasn't scared, I was just confused. He obviously didn't mean any harm, but at the same time, I knew he was still a stranger and not to be trusted. The guy paid for his stuff and left, and I waited until he was out of earshot before telling my dad about what the man had said and done. I was also confused as to why my dad seemed so angry, and it was Mom who had to explain that it wasn't okay for any stranger to touch me anywhere for any reason at all. They told me that I did the right thing, and apparently the guy came back a few days later only for my dad to chase him out of the store and tell him to never come back. A few years go by and I was still too young to really remember this, but Mom and Dad said that one day the creepy guy's face was all over the papers after state troopers had raided the house that he lived in out in the middle of nowhere. He was living out in some old house with no electricity, no running water, basically living like some doomsday prepper completely detached from society. And with him were a bunch of female relatives, ones that he was inbreeding with. I think they must have rescued about half a dozen of those girls, most of them products of incest, and even though it was a huge, huge story, my parents managed to keep me pretty sheltered from it until I ended up finding out on my own. I was much older then, but it wasn't much easier to take realizing what the guy meant when he said, "The key to everything is right inside here." And it makes me sick to my stomach that people like that are just existing out there like they do. And it makes me feel even sicker that I had one of them lay his dirty, rotten finger right on me. I suppose he thought that he was letting me in on a little wisdom of his, when really, he was showing me what a sick, evil bastard he was deep down.
This happened when I was 12 years old at an all-boys sleepaway camp in 2010. It was nicknamed Camp Boone in the Carolinas and was a one-week camp for kids who were mainly into the outdoors. It's a really nice camp in the middle of the woods with lots of streams, hiking trails, and even a big lake. It wasn't exactly Boy Scouts or anything, but just the sheer desire for kids my age to have a good summer. We do have to watch out for bears, black panthers, and even black widows, which were all native to North Carolina. The first day we had gotten there, our camp counselor had told us to unpack our belongings and to put them in our assigned cabins. We'd be staying in these small cabins appropriate for about 4 campers. The first few days went pretty well for the most part, with us doing several activities around the camp. These activities usually ranged anywhere from archery to whitewater rafting. However, it was that Thursday night where things took an unexpected turn. It was around 6 p.m., and our group had just finished eating at the dining hall in the lodge. After we had eaten, our camp counselors had gathered our group to go roast marshmallows by the fire pit. Now, the way that this fire pit is set up is that it's located a little ways away from the camp in the woods. Basically, you had to go through this trail that led into a large clearing, and in the center of that was the fire pit. In other words, it was surrounded by a bunch of trees which could easily catch on fire. We all sat down on the provided chairs around the campfire where we had begun sharing stories and making s'mores. Anyway, it's around 9 p.m. at night, and one of the counselors was telling us a story about his scary experience working the night shift. As he's about halfway through the story, our whole group suddenly hears what sounded like a large branch snap from somewhere in the woods. Everyone immediately goes quiet, as if a switch were turned off. Keep in mind that we were quite a ways away from the campsite, which meant that we were in bear territory, which we thought what made the sound. The counselors look at each other with these concerned faces and proceed to take out their bear spray. Almost instantly, we were told to pack up and get back on the trail immediately. We pack up our things, put out the fire, and shined our flashlights to light the way. We find the trail, and as we were getting back on it, we hear clear as day a blood-curdling scream behind us. Almost instantly, everyone comes to a complete stop, and we shine our flashlights by a few trees where we heard it. I'm not sure what it was, but something about the scream really unsettled me. It almost didn't sound human. One of our senior counselors tells us to run and to not look back while he radioed security of the camp. As we were running, the scream was heard again, this time a lot louder, indicating that whatever this was following us. We run for a good few minutes with some of the younger campers nearly crying before we got back to camp. Waiting for us at the lodge was a pair of rangers who had questioned our counselors while we stayed indoors. Rangers and the SOC had went to the area where we had heard the screams but were unable to find anything. This meant that whoever or whatever it was never followed us out of those woods. For those of you who don't know what the SOC is, it's basically the Police of the Woods, which stands for the Summit Operations Center. They basically get dispatched for situations if someone goes missing, a threat to the camp, or any natural hazards. I remember us having to cut the trip early that night, with a bus coming to pick us up in the morning. Our parents were obviously informed about what had happened, with some even pulling their children out of the camp program. It was a sad turnout, but at the end of the day, I could understand why they chose to. I stuck around with that summer camp for a couple more years before finally leaving once I got into my high school years. What was once a nice summer camp full of awesome activities, only to be turned into something much more upsetting. Up until now, that day still brings back those memories of what happened. I have a few theories as to what actually happened that night, but they're too complicated to explain. This just goes to show you that nothing good happens in the woods. This happened back in 2006 at a sleepaway camp in rural Georgia. I was around 13 years old, and it was the midsummer, meaning no school for a whole 3 months. I'd always go to sleepaway camp every summer, and it was a pretty good experience if you wanted to get out more. It was a 5-week trip, and for the first 2 weeks, things went pretty well with tons of activities us young teens would be into. One night, one of our head counselors had told us that we'd be doing an optional early morning activity. It was an annual ritual the campers did called the Polar Bear Ice Challenge. Basically, how it worked was one of the counselors would throw in a watermelon at the bottom of a lake, and the first person to find and grab it won a prize. However, the only hazard was that the water was extremely cold, even during the summer. It was a meaningless activity, but we enjoyed doing it. The next morning at around 6 a.m., the campers who had volunteered woke up and two of our counselors led us to the lake. The counselors lined us up on the dock and explained the rules. No teaming, no horseplaying, no fighting, etc. That being said, he grabbed the watermelon, threw it into the lake, and blew the whistle. We all dive in and were met with the extreme coldness that almost caused us to get out. I tried diving back into the water to try and feel for the melon when something grabs my foot and starts pulling. Figuring it was another camper, I tried resisting to make him let go. It was then when I realized that whatever was pulling me didn't feel like a hand. It felt so abnormal, I couldn't see what it was. After what seemed like forever, I managed to go to the surface where I could see all of the scouts on the bank looking at me. One of the counselors immediately realizes as to what's happening and dives in and manages to make whatever was drowning me let go. He pulls me to shore and everyone is questioning me, but all I could tell them was that something had pulled me. The two counselors look at me, and my ankle is bright red. We go back to camp where my parents and a health assistant were called. The staff at the camp had dismissed the redness as a rash, but none of us bought it. I haven't been back to that site since, and I'm not sure if I ever will. I still don't know what it was that grabbed me, but I sure as hell don't want to find out. It wasn't until a couple of years later where I had brought it up over dinner with my family. My mom and dad looked at me wide-eyed and told me something I didn't know. As it turns out, there was someone who had lived nearby and went into the lake trying to mess with people. He did this by using a metal wire, which is why my ankle was red. That whole campground closed down because of it and was unable to reopen until the investigation was over. She says I should be very grateful we weren't in that water for too long, as it could have been a whole lot worse. That was the scariest thing that's ever occurred in my life.
This happened 2 years ago, and it still puts me on edge thinking about it. My husband, myself, and our then 2-year-old daughter moved to Tennessee to get a fresh start on life. We were all exhausted after a long drive and just wanted to get out the mattresses. My parents, who lived in Tennessee already, were helping us unload. Naturally, all the neighbors in our apartment complex came out and said hi. That's when we met Ben. Right away, I got creepy vibes off of him. Our daughter, who to this day is way too friendly to strangers, hid behind my husband and visibly cringed. We made small talk, but mainly paid more attention to unloading our stuff than chatting with our new neighbors. My dad later told me that at one point, he came back to the truck and saw Ben staring at our daughter. My dad called him out, and when Ben denied it, my husband eventually told him to go. Later that night, me and my husband were still going through our stuff. Our daughter was staying the night at my parents' house. It was about 10:30 p.m. when we heard a knock at the door. Thinking that it was the pizza that I ordered, my husband opened the door, and there stood Ben. He asked us if we needed any help. Him showing up at our door so late at night, even for a friendly neighbor, was just creepy. Before we could tell him to get lost, he demanded a cigarette. Not only was he a total weirdo, but now he was just being plain rude. Neither of us smoked, and when we told him, he got a bit pissed. He started yelling and screaming at my husband and began pounding on the wall. This guy was unhinged. Thankfully, our landlord lived across the way from us at the time and came out to tell him off. As Ben sauntered away, our landlord explained to us that Ben is the resident pest and suffered from mental issues, but overall was harmless as long as he took his meds. Yeah, because that's exactly what you want to hear on your first night in a new place. After that, life kind of fell into place, and we settled in without any further disruptions. We had crazy schedules and would sometimes work graveyard shifts. I would get home around midnight and would see Ben standing outside the apartment buildings. He would always seem to be staring at me. I would just ignore him, mainly because I was just too tired and wanted to get to bed. He would always ask me for cigarettes, and I kept telling him that I didn't smoke. My husband said that he did the same thing to him. We would change up our work times just to throw Ben off a little, and at first, it worked, but Ben started to pester us during the day. On our days off, we would take our kid to the park or the mountains. One time, Ben asked to come with us, said that he was great with kids, and that we could trust him alone with our daughter. I really should have just let my husband deck him in the face right then and there. When we came back, he was sitting in our parking spot, said that he was making sure no one parked in it. He then tried to hug our daughter, and she screamed and clung on to me for dear life. I took her into the house while my husband finally snapped and really gave the guy an earful, telling him just to leave us alone. We told the landlord, but they played the whole mental issues card. And look, I get it. Mental illness is never fun to deal with, but he was constantly harassing and terrifying my daughter, and we have a duty to protect our family. It got to the point where my daughter didn't want to go outside because the bad man would be out there and stare at her. We threatened to cut our lease if something wasn't done about it. I began talking to my other neighbors, and everyone seemed to have the same type of experience. One of my neighbors told me that he and another neighbor saw Ben staring at some of the young girls wearing bathing suits and short shorts by the community pool, and they chased him off. They reported this to the landlord, but nothing was ever done. After about a month, things had quieted down. Ben wasn't spotted outside anymore. In fact, no one really saw him. We figured he moved away or something. Good riddance. We were thinking about moving in with my folks, while we saved up the money for a real house. One night, I came home from work early. My husband was out of town because of work, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit some family. I decided to play Saints Row 4 and relax after working an 11-hour shift. I was deep into the game when someone knocked on the door. It was about 10 p.m. at this point. If anyone was coming over that late, they would have called or texted first. I got up to see who it was. Before I got to the door, the knob began to shake violently. Then I heard Ben screaming, "Let me in! Open this goddamn door!" The heavy knocking turned into him slamming his shoulder against the door. He was screaming like a deranged madman. I grabbed my phone, the sharpest knife that we had from the kitchen, and hid in the closet. Cliché, I know, but if he managed to get in, there would at least be some distance between us. I called 911, and they said that my other neighbors had called in as well. It was only after I heard the sirens stop and voices yelling outside that I felt safe to come out. I opened my door and saw a cop pinning Ben face down on the ground. The landlord was screaming at the cop to let him go, and he even shoved him. Both of them ended up being arrested. I gave my report, and each one of my neighbors backed up everything I said, and even added in their own experiences. My sweet church lady neighbor called my husband and parents to let them know what was going on, and she even let me stay with her and her family for the night. But after what happened, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking that at any moment I would hear Ben's deranged screaming and pounding from outside. It turns out Ben was a registered sex offender. Rumor has it that the landlord was aware of it, but willingly overlooked it as Ben's family would slip him extra money as long as he was allowed to stay there. That's why nothing was ever done about his behavior. Makes me sick. Ben really did take meds, but had not been on any of them for the past few months. He tried to tell the cops that our daughter was his and that we kidnapped her, and that I was having an affair with him. Crazy, right? Last thing I heard, Ben was placed in some institution. I'm not sure if it was prison or a psych ward. The landlord was fired and pretty much chased out of town. Good riddance. We were offered 3 months rent-free for our trouble, but that was ultimately our breaking point. We sold off most of our belongings and moved in with my parents. I'm happy to say that we have a house now, and our daughter is not afraid to go outside anymore. And yes, we checked all of our neighbors for red dots.
This story takes place in the early 1990s. I was 10 or 11 at the time. My family and I lived in a rural area near Kansas City. This particular area nowadays is very different from what it was in the 90s. Back in the day, it was a very country-like atmosphere. The road that we lived on was a gravel road, and the traffic was very sporadic. Typically, the only people who drove down our road were people who lived on our street, and there were only a few houses on our street at the time. Across the street from the house that we moved into, there was a large cornfield with a few trees near the road. There were a few other boys my age who lived on our street, and we all thought it would be fun to build a treehouse or a fort of some kind. I was across the street nearly every day, and my friends would often walk to my house and then we would go across the street to play in the fort. Think of that scene in the 1990 TV miniseries of Stephen King's It, where the Losers Club was building that dam in the river outside Derry. Yep, it's just like that. One day, I was across the street with one of the other boys. We noticed that there was a small blue car that would drive up and down the street very slowly. Since our road was very narrow and gravelly, it was not unusual for people to drive kind of slow. But this car in particular was driving extremely slow. I noticed that the driver would look out of his window and just sort of eyeball me every time that he drove by. I saw him at least 2 or 3 times that afternoon, but at the time, I remember thinking that he probably either just was curious about our playhouse, or that he was lost and maybe contemplating about asking us for directions. After a while, my friend had to go home, so I was there all by myself. Not long after my friend had left, I saw that same blue car slowly coming down the street once again, but this time, he came to a stop. The driver just sat there and stared at me for a while. I got this uneasy feeling about him. I knew all about stranger danger, even at that age. I began to feel that something bad was going to happen. My dad's words echoed in my head. If a stranger tries to grab you, you run as fast as you can and you scream your head off. I started thinking about which direction I should take off to. I knew that if I ran in the opposite direction of the guy in the car, I would be running into a cornfield that was at least a mile wide in every direction. If I were to run towards my house, I would have to cross the street, meaning that I would have to go past the creepy guy in the car to get to my home. The situation terrified me. My heartbeat escalated as I tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do. While deciding which direction would give me the best chance of getting away, I noticed the man in the car reach down for something. I never did see what he was going for, but something told me that if I didn't start running at that moment, I would be history. I then saw the man open the car door just a crack. I knew my dad was home at the time, so I decided to make a break for it. I knew that I was going to have to cross the street and I would have to get past the man's car. I began running as fast as I could alongside the road in the opposite direction of where his car was facing. I could see out of the corner of my eye that the guy had closed his door. When I reached the road, the driver had put his car in reverse. If I had been a second slower, I wouldn't have made it. The trunk of his car barely missed me as I darted away from the street to my driveway. I began screaming as loud as I could while charging towards my house. My dad ran outside to meet me in the driveway. When I had turned around to show my dad the man in the car, he was gone. All I could see was the dust cloud coming off the gravel road as the mysterious man in his blue car sped out of there. That night, I had a nightmare. I was running down a seemingly endless gravel road. I was panting, sweating, terrified. I would look back and see that blue car getting closer and closer. I woke up my parents. Apparently, I had been yelling in my sleep. I had to sleep in their room for a while, but the night terrors eventually did stop. This was nearly 2 decades ago, but I still remember it very well. There is no doubt in my mind that the man in the blue car was the monsters that your parents tell you about when you're a kid. Had I not run off when I did, I would probably be nothing but a statistic today. I occasionally hear stories about kids who went missing in my area in the 90s, and I wonder if it has anything to do with that man in the blue car. I may never know for sure, but I understand now why my dad always told me to run and scream. I'll be instructing my own children someday to do the same.
My mother was 14 in 1986 when this happened. She lived in China at the time with her parents and younger brother. It was deep into winter when this occurred, and the temperature dropped into the negatives. Snow was falling in thick layers onto the ground. It was around 10 p.m. when my mother finished up her classes, and by then it was dark. Bear in mind, in China it's normal for young students to walk home alone without a parent or guardian. About 10 minutes after getting off the bus, she began walking through this old marketplace to get to her apartment. The marketplace was completely quiet and deserted at this time of night. There was also no lampposts around, so it was hard for my mom to properly see where she was going. But she had traveled this route several times before, so she was familiar and knew her way back home. My mother had this feeling that someone was lurking in the darkness of the marketplace. She tried to shrug it off, but the apprehension persisted. She continued to hear her feet crunching on the white snow. But suddenly, she stopped, and as she did, she could hear a second pair of feet crunching the snow behind her. My mom panicked, but she continued forward and pretended that she hadn't heard anything. She thought it might have been another student making their way back to their living quarters. This thought made sense, but it didn't stop her from walking faster. As she began to pick up her pace, the crunching snow behind her also began to speed up. My mother couldn't handle the fear any longer and started running, but the thick snow made it difficult for her to run away quickly. She also gave a quick look behind her. She was greeted by the silhouette of a tall man only a few meters away and closing in. The man did not appear to be wearing a coat, despite the freezing temperature. The lack of lampposts made it difficult for my mom to make out anything else. However, that's not what scared my mom the most. She was eventually chased into an area that was lit by a dim light mounted to the side of a merchant stall. When she looked back, she was able to see that her pursuer was carrying a large plank in his hand. Now petrified, she continued to run and refused to look back again. Suddenly, she saw the light of a lamppost that was situated on a small street. Luckily that night, there happened to be a young couple walking towards her. With her last ounce of energy, my mom ran to them and collapsed. My mom was in hysterics when they asked her what was wrong. She explained to them what happened, but by then, the stranger had vanished. The couple that she ran into was living in the same apartment block as her and was familiar with her father. They accompanied her back home, and they told my grandfather where they found her. After the couple left, my mom couldn't stop crying out of shock and fear. From then on, my grandfather would meet my mom at the bus stop where she got off at, and they would walk home together. My mom never found out who her assailant was, and thankfully, she never had another encounter with him again. I was reading a story that reminded me of an event from over 20 years ago. It was around the second half of 1998. I had taken a security guard job at a plant that manufactured locks. I usually worked one of 3 shifts, 4 p.m. to 12 a.m., 7:30 p.m. to 3:30 a.m., 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. The 7:30-3:30 shift was for extra coverage, so there were always two of us from 7:30 to midnight. It was a very routine, boring job for the most part. We did our rounds, logged everything out of the ordinary, and watched a tiny monitor displaying the CCTV feed. Things went by in an almost peaceful manner. I worked, saved, bought a car, and had planned to move. By late March of 1999, I served my notice and prepared to head cross-country. A new hire was brought in to fill my spot, a soft-spoken man named Calvin. As part of his training, Calvin spent time working all 3 shifts. At night, he was a shadow, working by himself, getting a feel for the plant's nocturnal routines. Most nights he worked with myself and a female guard named Amira, who was around my age. I was 18 at the time. Calvin was about a decade or so older than us. He was quiet and polite, though something seemed to be missing. There's usually a spark that genuinely nice people seem to have, and it just wasn't there. Whenever he went on rounds with me, he would ask questions about the job and make small talk. I noticed that he was a bit odd, laughing at odd times and changing his tone mid-sentence. At the time, I chalked it up to him just being socially awkward, and that would pass. One night, near the end of his first week, he went on a round with Amira. When they returned to the office, I knew there was something wrong. Amira was normally very talkative, but she would barely say a word. I wasn't sure what happened. I waited until Calvin went to the restroom to ask. During their rounds, everything had been normal until they reached the brass mill. It's a section of the plant that shut down around 6 a.m. There were usually no employees there after that time, and there were no lights on. They were making their way to a checkpoint on a landing atop a flight of stairs when the mood shifted. Amira told me that she turned around only to find he was right on her. Startled, she backed against the grating at the end of the landing, and he leaned in towards her, his face nearly touching hers. He said something flirtatious to her in a very low voice. When she mentioned his wedding band, he said, "It's gonna be over soon." From then on, I did the rounds, taking Calvin with me each time. The night ended without further incident, and I left a note for our supervisor, detailing what happened. The next night came and went, with no Calvin. I did the rounds while Amira stayed in the office. On my second to last shift, I came in to find Amira freaking out. She found out why Calvin hadn't been at work. Apparently he had been arrested for murdering his wife. She had been dismembered and burned. Parts of her body had been placed in a pond less than a mile from where we worked. That night and the next, Amira called the jail just to make sure that they were still holding him. Based on the time frame, he had killed his wife months before he even started that job. There is an article linked below. This story didn't happen to me personally. It happened to 2 of my cousins. They gave me permission to share this story, so I will be telling it from their perspective. My name is Leah. This story happened in April of 2016. I was 29 years old at the time. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. In April, my cousin and I, who I'll refer to as Kate, wanted to go for a Caribbean getaway. But we didn't want to go to the popular tourist destinations, such as the Bahamas, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, or Puerto Rico. So we chose a lesser-known island called Dominica. It's a small island located between Guadeloupe and Martinique, with a population of about 72,000. We booked an Airbnb in the countryside, about 30 minutes away from the capital city. The first 2 weeks went well. We rented a car, and the Airbnb was perfect as it was located near a beach. It was the getaway that we needed. We explored the island, visited several waterfall locations, and even made some friends in the village we were staying at. But on the second day of the third week, something horrible happened. One afternoon, we didn't go out and decided just to spend time at the nearby beach with the locals. Later on, when the people left the beach to go home, Kate wanted to go back to the Airbnb, but I decided to stay there a while longer so I could have some alone time. I closed my eyes and laid down near the beach, enjoying the peace and quiet. I must have dozed off because before I knew it, it was dark, so I decided it was a good time to head back. I arrived at the Airbnb, but as I was getting my keys to unlock the door, 2 men wearing masks came out of the bushes and started beating me with batons. One even threw a rock at me while I was down, causing me to scream in pain. Kate came out and tried to defend me, but the men also overpowered her. They ran into the Airbnb and ransacked the entire place. Some nearby villagers saw what was happening and quickly came to our aid, but by that time, the 2 men had already fled. They had taken my laptop, my phone, and my wallet. Luckily for us, our passports weren't stolen. We were both bleeding pretty badly. At some point, I felt like I was going to pass out. The police eventually showed up, and after receiving some medical assistance, we told them what happened. They were shocked. Dominica is usually a pretty safe country. 2 of the villagers drove us to the hospital, which was located in the capital city of Roseau. We had to stay in the hospital for a while because our injuries were so bad. We even had to change our return flight. Thankfully, we got out alive. As far as I know, the 2 perpetrators who attacked us were never caught. This event has forever traumatized Kate and I. However, I still like Dominica and would love to go visit there again someday. But next time, I'll be a lot more cautious.
A few years ago, I was working at a pizza chain in my local town of Ocala, Florida as a delivery driver. Those who are familiar with Central Florida will probably know what I'm talking about. Rolling hills, flatlands, springs, swamps, you name it, Ocala had it all. I was 25, but I made damn good money doing it as rural families were generally more wealthy than most. I had worked at many other places before, both local and chain, but I favored local businesses more. I'd also like to note that I'm a firm believer in God and thank Him till this day for saving my life. One night, I was working and I had an order of 5 large pies to deliver. People don't normally order this much amount of pizza around here, so I could only assume it was a party of some type. My boss wrote down the address for me, and it was on the more busier side of town. This made me feel comfortable, as I typically don't like delivering to rural homes far apart from each other. I'm still not sure why, but that's just how it was. That being said, I do the delivery and drove over to the address, which took me to an apartment complex in town. I had never seen this complex before, as I normally don't go over to the center of town, but I guess it was nice to do deliveries at different locations. I grab the order and go up to the apartment and knock on room 104. This will be important in the story later. I was greeted to a younger guy, I'd say a little younger than me, as well as another guy who appeared to be the same age. Order for Caleb? I said. Without even saying a word, one of the men takes the pizza from me while the other said in a very blunt voice as to how much it was. I tell them the total came out to be $60.83 and the 2 just look at each other in confusion. One of them spoke up, giving me the side eye as he said that wasn't what he was told over the phone. "Oh, let me double check. Maybe I made a mistake," I said. Okay, so I obviously knew that this had to be the correct amount, as my boss makes us triple check all details, so I knew I had this right. I read over the receipt just to be sure, and lo and behold, I was indeed correct. I show them the receipt for proof, and that's when I see one of them nervously looking around while the other is just staring at me. The very second I was about to say something, one of the men pulls out a gun and points it at my head. At that point, I couldn't even speak or begin to form a sentence for that matter. The kid with the gun says in this really raspy voice to hand him my wallet, keys, and phone or he won't hesitate to pull the trigger. I very nervously said okay and slowly reached into my pockets for all my belongings he requested and handed them to him. They then tell me to come inside slowly and to sit down on one of the chairs by the kitchen table. I comply and walk over to the kitchen where one of them sits me down and proceeds to tie my hands with duct tape. I was pretty much screwed at this point as I couldn't go anywhere as they had the keys to the company car and they sure as hell wouldn't give them back. One of the guys opens my phone and starts to go through it, deleting anything he could find. At one point, I see him land on a picture of my girlfriend, which shocked me to my core. Just a year ago, my girlfriend died in a fatal car crash, and I had photos of her on my phone to keep as memories. Hey, please don't delete those. They're the only thing I have left to remember my girlfriend. However, they didn't seem to care and actually ended up deleting them purely out of spite. I'll admit I got teared up a bit seeing them do that and didn't know what else to do other than to just sit there and watch. I remember sitting there just wondering as to what the hell these people were gonna do to me, and I almost threw up. All the while, I'm praying to God I make it out safe and to let me go from whatever this was. I'd say I kept asking them what they wanted from me several times before one of them just demands for me to shut up. Now, this is the part where things take an unexpected turn. As they were going through my phone while also counting the money in my wallet, we all hear the sound of a window crash in one of the rooms of their apartment. This noise obviously concerned them as they took off running to the room where they heard it. I hear one of them shout, "Who's there?" Had someone broken into their apartment? I thought to myself. What actually happened will leave you speechless. Right then, I knew that this was my chance to leave and start biting off the tape tied around my hands, hoping to rip it off. Somehow I managed to do this and was set free within a few seconds as I was biting down pretty hard. I knew that they would be back any second, and so I just run toward the door and start unlocking the 3 locks that were built into the door. Yeah, no wonder why they don't want anyone finding out about this, I thought to myself. I make it out the door and book it out of the apartment building, not looking back and just trying to find help. It was then when I remembered I didn't have my phone, so I couldn't call the police, so I took that chance to run to the nearest shop. They were thankfully very polite and let me use their phone to call the police. Law enforcement was more professional in Ocala compared to major cities in Florida, so they got here relatively fast. However, when they asked me what room they were in, I couldn't remember the damn room number. This apartment building was huge, with about 100 plus rooms, so I couldn't remember the number. Eventually, I had remembered that I wrote it down, and police then went up to go investigate. Turns out that loud crash we heard was actually a large tree smashing a window. The tree had been broken from the storm and just so happened to fall through the window. As for those 2 men, they were gone. They must have left through the front door when they realized I had already been gone. Needless to say, they were never caught, even after an investigation. Till this day, I feel that tree smashing the window was a distraction made by God to help me escape. I guess it could have been some stroke of luck, but I honestly have no idea. I'm a male, currently 22 and in college going for my bachelor's. I have a part-time job at a hospital, but I also did DoorDash on the side to earn more money. This happened last week during one of my delivery trips, and it's by far the creepiest thing I've ever experienced in my 2+ years of DoorDash. I was out one night with my friend during the middle of the week looking for any orders we could take. Since it was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night, there weren't many places open besides fast food. My friend had come along with me as I liked the company, and let's face it, driving alone sucks. Eventually, I get a few orders here and there until I got one that was a little ways away from my normal delivery radius. It was about a 25-minute drive, but at the end of the day, it meant more money in my pocket. Whoever it was ordered from a nearby McDonald's, which was expected at this time of night. That said, I retrieved the order, and before I knew it, we were already halfway to the destination. My GPS led us to one of those terrace homes that always seemed like one big townhouse that you would commonly see. The customer had noted that they wanted it handed to them, which I sort of hated if I'm being honest. Most people would prefer if it were left at the door, but I guess not everyone is the same. My friend and I grabbed the order and started heading toward the door. However, as we were getting ready to ring the doorbell, the door immediately opens where we were greeted to a younger-looking Asian man. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s and was absolutely stoned. However, he was still stable and was able to make conversation with us, and he actually seemed pretty cool at first. He asked us how our night was, how old we were, and where we went to school. You know, casual small talk questions. Granted, he had somewhat of a small accent, but we could still understand what he was saying. After about a good 5 minutes of chatting, we hand him his order and he just puts it on the table next to him and says something we didn't expect. Still stoned out of his mind, he asks us if we'd be interested in having a beer with him. I look at my friend and he sort of just shrugs and says sure. Normally I'd say no, but seeing as to how chill this guy was, we didn't think anything of it. We walk into the house and he hands us each a cold beer and proceeds to start up an actual conversation with us, mostly about his life. At one point, he gets up and tells us to wait as he says he has to step out to take a quick phone call. The man steps into another room and shuts the door behind him. So there we were, just chilling while talking to my friend when I hear the man speaking Japanese in another room. Now, my stepmother is from Japan, so while I understand a fair bit of Japanese, I don't speak it. So I hear him talking but pay no attention because it's rude to eavesdrop and all. That was until he said something along the lines of, "The people in my kitchen won't find out." That's when my ears perk up. To put it simply, he was basically talking to someone on the phone and how he was planning on keeping us silent just in case. That was enough to quietly tell my friend what was going on and that we had to leave. However, as we got up, he comes back out and sees the look on our faces, and it was at that point where he had caught on. His face went from a friendly smile to a disappointed look as if he knew we had hurt him. I tell him that it was nice to meet him, but that we had to go. He said nothing and just watches us as we walk out the door, not saying a word. As soon as we start the car, we see him come out of the house waving a gun like a madman. He fires 2 shots into my front fender of my car before we hightail it out of there. All the while, my friend is crying as he swore a bullet ripped through his seat. We drive for about 10 minutes before I call the police to explain my situation. After giving a description of this man to the police, they had sent in squads of police units to the address. Turns out, this guy was a member of the Japanese Yakuza and was wanted for murder and importing illegal goods into the US. He used an alias for about 4 years and was somehow never caught. I don't know about you, but encountering a mafia member is probably the scariest thing that can happen to anyone. Shortly after entering his home, they had ended his life on the spot. For starters, authorities had found several files on his computer and even found drugs and weapons inside these crates he had locked away. All of these things were obviously highly illegal, and police even went as far as locking down the whole neighborhood. I'm not sure why they did this, but I guess that's just how these things work. The craziest thing about this is the fact that I fed him his last meal. That still bothers me for some reason till this day. My name is Alex, and this happened just yesterday late last night with my girlfriend. For a very brief 4 months or so, I worked as a delivery driver for a few food delivery apps at the time. Mostly being active on Uber Eats and DoorDash, as those were the ones that tended to be more popular. I didn't expect to make big money from this side hustle, but it helped with other small things like groceries and utilities. I live in the suburbs of LA, which is a very crowded part of the city, so deliveries were usually quick and close. Anyway, this happened last night while my girlfriend and I were doing deliveries. We had just gotten home from a friend's party, and while most people would be exhausted, we were surprisingly still active. Not knowing what to do, my girlfriend and I decided we'd go out and do a few deliveries just to have some us time. Being in the car with a loved one always felt like a special sort of vibe. Anyway, almost immediately, someone requested a large order from a local Wingstop, and I was the one who accepted it. Big orders usually meant that the customer would have to tip more, aka more money for me. We drive to the location, and I tell my girlfriend to wait in the car while I go get the food. Now, Wingstop usually takes a bit of time before the order is ready, which meant I had to wait a few minutes. Once the food had been done, I grab it and start heading back to the car when I see my girlfriend is stoned as a statue. She's sitting in the front seat with her eyes wild and had a look of fear. At first, I was confused as to why she was like that and motioned for her to roll down the window while asking her what the hell happened. She slowly flicks the button and tells me in a shook voice to get in the car. I do just that, and we drove over to the destination while I continued to ask what was wrong. After what felt like forever, she finally tells me everything, and what she told me made my stomach drop. As I was inside the restaurant waiting for the food, my girlfriend had been on her phone texting a friend when she looks out the window. Practically hovering over the window was a very large and tall man who looked to be at least 6'7". He wore all black and was staring at my girlfriend with this very angry look, and in his hand was a window smasher. His face was red and his eyes were menacing, as if he had this strong hatred towards my girlfriend. However, she couldn't move or say anything. She simply turned to face the front and hoped that he'd just leave. After about a decent minute, he thankfully did, and that was when I had come out of the restaurant. Now, there's no real way to say this without trying to brag, but my girlfriend is very pretty. Like, she's cute, and her looks would oftentimes attract a lot of faces. My theory was that the man who had come up to the car had seen her and knew she was with me, as he had probably been watching us. We didn't really bother calling the police, as there wasn't really something to be done about it. After that, we had called it a night and went straight home, as she couldn't shake off the paranoia. Up until now, I'm still not exactly sure as to what the man wanted or what his intentions were. But if he had a device to break windows, they couldn't have been good. From now on, my girlfriend and I have agreed that whenever we do orders together, that we'd both be the ones to go inside.
I'm a male, and I was around 8 or 9 when this happened. Obviously, I don't remember much since I was a kid, so I had recently asked my mom what she remembered about that day. My mom was taking my sister and I to see a movie. We had decided to stop at McDonald's to kill some time. A strange guy wearing a purple suit had followed us in and had sat at a nearby table without ordering anything. After we finished eating, I had got up to go clean up my retainer in the bathroom sink. The man followed me into the bathroom and then stood between me and the door. He asked me if I wanted a juice box. I said no, but he had told me that I needed to go out to his car with him so I could pick out the flavor. My parents had drilled into my head to never ever go with a stranger, so I immediately knew what was happening. I ran past him and out of the bathroom door into the lobby, then told my mom what had happened. He had followed me out and started coming towards us. My mom stood up and started making a big scene. She had loudly asked him why he was trying to get her son to go out to his car with him. He said that he was just trying to give me a juice box, and then hurriedly left and then got into his car and drove off. Luckily, there was a police car in the parking lot, so we had waved down a cop and told him what had happened. Unfortunately, the man in the purple suit was long gone by this point. I had forgotten most of what had happened before and after the incident, but I still vividly remember the terror I felt being alone in the bathroom with him blocking the door. It was only 10 to 20 seconds, but I'll never forget that uneasy feeling. I'm really grateful that my mom was such a rock star and that she knew how to make a scene to scare him off. I have no idea what would have happened to me had I actually gone out there with him. I'm a 17-year-old female, and I recently quit my job at a fast food chain after working there for almost 10 months. This story is part of the reason why I didn't want to stay much longer. I worked the drive-thru from 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. almost every weekend. Seeing regulars was not uncommon for me, and I would even memorize most of their orders and fill it out as soon as I heard their voice. Most were very polite and occasionally tipped, but on one particularly busy day, there was an unfamiliar, weary presence. I had just started my shift, so I was running food to the window. I had made eye contact with the man at the window in his car and immediately felt uneasy. I brushed it off because we were busy and I had work to do. Later on, once my manager set up my cash drawer, I took over drive-thru orders, payments, etc. There were lots of orders, so I wasn't paying special attention to specific voices or menu choices, but one had caught my attention. It was a low, hesitant voice asking for a sandwich. I give the man the total and he waits in line. He arrives at the window and it's the man from earlier. I assumed that he just forgot to order something. Now, his car was pretty low to the ground, so he had to extend his arm out to hand me his debit card. As he does this, he then mumbles something under his breath without even breaking eye contact with me. "I'm sorry, what was that?" I question him.
I said you're looking beautiful today.
At this point, I'm super uncomfortable. Not only do I have a boyfriend, but I'm also underage and I'm not interested at all. "Oh, thank you," I said nervously. I then handed him the bag of food and then quickly shut the window until he drove away. I half-heartedly complained about him to some coworkers, all male as we usually do with weird customers, but I still had a strange gut feeling. A little while later, when the average wait in our line was about 10 minutes, I hear a familiar voice over the mic asking for a cup of water. It was low but agitated and forceful. I saw his face through the windshield and walked away from the window so that my manager would take care of him. This happened a couple of more times that day, asking for straws and other free things. At that point, I was pretty sure that he was just trying to look at me. I was so frustrated with him and the rest of my workday that I went to the bathroom and just cried. I usually have pretty thick skin when it comes to this kind of stuff, but I was just so over it. The rest of the night went on and I didn't see him again. I thought that I'd probably never see him again. That is, until my very last shift at the store a few months later. We weren't very busy that evening, but it was much later in the day than the first encounter. I didn't recognize the voice, but I had immediately recognized his face and car. I just swallowed my pride and took his payment, trying not to make eye contact. I had called my manager and he said he would give the food out for me. As suspected, the man was back in the drive-thru not long afterwards for a cup of water. This time I knew better. I had sent a male coworker to the window to get it for him since I was busy anyway. Once given the water, the man had actually asked my coworker. "So, you guys close at 11 now, right?" I was so glad that I was getting picked up by my mom that night. I was constantly looking out the windows, just making sure that he wasn't out there waiting for me. Call me paranoid, but I listened to enough true crime to be overly cautious.
This story is told in the perspective of a female. This happened to me a few days ago on my way home after a long and busy day at work. I work right smack in the middle of downtown Salt Lake City, and I lived in the suburbs, so it was a long drive back home. My boss, being the asshole he was, gave me a week of closing shifts during the week I was supposed to be out of town for vacation. However, he said that the company needed extra help and told me I couldn't go. Needless to say, I was pissed, but hey, you can't always win, right? It was around 7, maybe 8 o'clock at night, and had about an hour to get home. I ended up taking a different route home, as this route would only take me about 45 minutes than the hour drive. Seeing the fact that I was dead tired and just wanting to go home, I decided to take the route. According to my GPS, I was about halfway home, listening to my music, when I hear my car start making this rattling noise. I cuss to myself as this noise continues, causing my car to come to a complete stop. Thankfully though, the road was empty, as no one ever used it at this time of night, but that obviously didn't solve the car problem. For context, I drive a 2003 Honda Civic, aka box, which always had problems with it. I'm only 19 and my job doesn't pay enough for me to afford a new car. I work 20 hours a week, making $15 an hour, so it was the only thing I could afford. I pop the hood and take a look at the car to see that my car battery was full of corrosion. Out of anger, I hit my car, knowing that I'd have to call a tow truck, which could be a mission seeing how far I was from the city. That being said, I called AAA, but they said it could take a while to send someone out due to the distance. Alright, whatever. I guess I didn't have a choice, right? Needless to say, I bite my lip, just waiting inside my car for the tow truck to come. After a while, I started to notice how alone I was on this road. It was dead silent, and all I could hear were the crickets from the woods. As I'm playing a game on my phone, I look in my rearview mirror and see a pair of headlights approaching me from the back. The closer it came, the more I made it out to be a truck. I thought that it could have been the tow truck, but as it pulled up behind my car, I saw that it was definitely not a tow truck. It was just a standard white pickup truck, and that's when I saw a man that appeared to be Hispanic step out and tap on my window. I'd say he was maybe in his mid-50s, asking me if I needed a lift. Trying to be safe, I lower my window just a tad and tell him that my car broke down, but that the tow truck was on its way. I thank him for the offer, but told him I had everything under control and that I didn't want to be a bother. For some reason though, this guy didn't seem to get the hint and began to ask me if I could open the door for him and that he could help me. This started to concern me now. He wasn't going away and was now trying to get in my car. Keep in mind, there's nobody else on this road, and I'm basically in the middle of nowhere with this person who seemed as if they were up to no good. He stares at me through the window for a good minute or so before walking back to his truck. I thought that was the end of it and that he would finally drive off, but boy was I wrong. After spending about 5 minutes in his truck, he comes back out and motions for me to roll down my window. I comply and roll down my window a bit and ask him what he wanted. This time in a more annoyed tone, as I didn't want anything to do with him. Somehow he notices my change of behavior and says that he's just trying to help and that there's no reason to get angry with him. I tell him that I didn't need help and that the tow truck would take care of me. He then goes on to explain that he had a pair of jumper cables in his truck and could easily get my car started. At this point, I see yet another pair of headlights coming from behind me and instantly recognized it as the tow truck. Yeah, look man, help is already here. Thank you for the offer, but I'd rather have the tow truck help me. By this point, the tow truck driver gets out and the man then looks both ways, turns to me, and walks back to his truck driving away. The tow truck driver then comes to my window and I open my door explaining the issue with my car's battery. As I'm telling him what's going on, he stops me mid-sentence and asks if I knew who that man was. I told him no and that he just pulled up behind me and tried to help. The tow truck driver just stared at me with this pale face and said that he's actually seen that man before. Turns out, he was a registered sex offender from 2 towns over and would sometimes be on this road at night looking to lure any unsuspecting women. This ranged anywhere from getting him to go with him somewhere to attempting to get in their cars, which is exactly what he tried doing. He was released from prison 3 years ago for good behavior and hasn't been seen since. The tow truck driver was almost certain it was him, as he was able to get a good look at him from the headlights of the tow truck. He tows my car away with him giving me a ride to the police station, making sure I was safe. I couldn't give an accurate description to the police other than that his truck was white. The police said they do some investigative work, but never got back to me about any leads. It's been almost a week now, and I'm still paranoid knowing that he's probably still out there. Had I been that dumb or naive to open my door or window for him, God, I don't even know what he might have done. One thing I will take from this is that I'll never drive down that road at night again, and I always carry pepper spray with me. This story is a bit short, but this is seriously one of the creepiest moments of my life. I'm a 26-year-old female and I was driving home from a friend's birthday party one night. I live in a very rural area of Tennessee, so there's a lot of hills, forests, and flatlands throughout most of the state. Anyway, on this particular night, I was driving through I-81 between Knoxville and Bristol. It was around 2 a.m. on a weeknight, so there were no other cars on this road other than mine. Now, whenever I'm out late at night, I always remember to have my nighttime coffee. This night, however, I didn't have my coffee, which caused me to become exhausted while behind the wheel. So there I am, driving for about 25 minutes when, out of nowhere, something jumps out onto the road from the trees. This scared me to the bone, causing me to let out an oh shit and brake hard. It looked like a person, to be honest, who just straight up jumped in front of my car as if they were trying to get hit. I only caught a glimpse of them and tried to see if I had ran someone over. I was ready to give this person a piece of my mind and got out of my car to see not a soul in sight. I was seemingly the only person on this road, and right then I started freaking out, wondering what the hell just happened. After taking a few minutes to compose myself, I get back in my car only for it to not start. I tried starting the engine several times, but nothing I did ever made it work. Long story short, I called a tow truck to give me a ride, and it took about a month to get my car back up and running. Till this day, I'm strongly convinced that whatever I had seen was completely paranormal and was the reason for my car dying. So, I'm a 25-year-old male, and this happened just last year in the summer. I was on a road trip from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Los Angeles, California. The reason for this trip was to visit my old friend from my childhood who I hadn't seen in years. Moving away from one of your best friends is enough to make anyone feel lonely and sad. His name was Jason, and we had been good friends ever since I could remember. I had only saw him once a year when I had time off from work, so this trip was very important to me. If I remember correctly, I was driving down a long stretch of road somewhere in Arizona when my car suddenly dies out of nowhere. Being rightfully pissed off, I hit my dashboard while trying to get the damn thing to start. Eventually, I get out of my car and open the hood. My car's battery had been covered in battery acid and had spread throughout the other components. I was stuck on an empty road in the middle of nowhere with nothing but desert and cliffs. I take out my phone to try and get a hold of Jason to see if he could come get me. When we were younger teens, we'd always have this little slogan when trying to reach each other. It went something along the lines of, "So-and-so, do you copy?" And I repeat the catchphrase, attempting to reach him. "Hey Jason, do you copy? I'm in a bit of a pickle here." However, signal around here was basically non-existent, so I had no other choice but to walk to the nearest town. All the while, I'm still trying to reach Jason, but there was no luck. About 15 minutes into my walk, I look behind me and notice two headlights in the distance getting closer and closer. It only took me a second to realize that it was a car, and I flagged them down while practically begging for help. Believe it or not, it seemed as if my prayers had come true, as the car then starts to slow down and pulls up next to me. Inside was an older-looking gentleman, and in the back were two younger men with a middle-aged woman wearing sunglasses in the middle. The two men seemed to be carrying her as she appeared to be asleep. The driver asked as to how they could be a help, and I explained my situation to them. One of the men in the back seat had said something about how that sounded like a you problem and that they'd be no help. I apologized, thanking them for their time, and told them I'd be on my way. However, that's when I noticed the woman in the car. She looked slumped over and just appeared to be out of it. I then asked in a direct tone to the driver, "Everything alright with her?" He then looks at the men, looks at me, and says, No, she's dead, but why is that your concern?" One of the men in the back take off her sunglasses, revealing her face. The second I saw her face, I can now see as to why she was deceased. Her lifeless body limped over the two men with her mouth hung open as if it had been broken. The driver then looks at me and says 6 words that have haunted me ever since. Calling the cops would be a mistake. I then back off and start running back to my car as the other car sped off until they were too far to be seen. Thankfully, my car willingly started back up again, where I was able to go to the next town and get a new battery. I obviously did inform the police about my encounter and gave them an exact description of the men. Up until now, however, there have been unfortunately no leads as to who might have been responsible. In the end, I did get to see my friend, and nothing happened again while on that trip. There are truly some sick and twisted people in this world that we just have to live with. It's unfortunately a harsh reality of life.
Hey everyone, my name is Dennis Blaze. I was around 17 when this happened. And to give you an idea of how long ago this took place, I am now 43 years old. I grew up in a small town across from Seattle during the late 90s. At the time, there was maybe a total population of 6,000 to 7,000 people. The town didn't really have a whole lot of things to do. One night I was hanging out with my 3 friends, who we'll call Gary, Mark, and Rob. We all got bored of just sitting at home, so we decided to go for a drive. We stopped to eat at a McDonald's before continuing our aimless endeavor. We had been driving for about 15 minutes after we left the restaurant. It must have been about 10 p.m. at this point. My vehicle was a '92 Ford Probe. Mark rolled down his window. I didn't think anything of it at first. I just figured he needed some air. We were descending a large hill when I saw a pair of headlights in the distance. The lights got closer, and I saw that it was a semi-truck, but it wasn't hauling a trailer behind it. As the semi-truck was approaching, I could see Mark sitting forward. I wasn't sure what he was doing. I then saw him throw something at the truck as it passed. "What the hell are you doing?" "Relax, it was just a sweet and sour packet from the Nuggets." I was annoyed, but I didn't think anything would happen. We got to the bottom of the hill. When I looked into the rearview mirror, I could now see the headlights from the semi-truck barreling down the hill, rushing directly at my car. Holy shit. Everyone in the car turned around at once. I think you just pissed him off, Mark." I quickly found a driveway to turn around, then raced back up the hill as fast as I could to gain some distance from the semi-truck. When I got to the top of the hill, I turned off all my lights, and everyone in the car told me to turn down this side road that was pitch dark. I could barely see a thing, but I decided to go for it. I then turned the car back around before putting it in park. We thought it would be a good idea to wait for a few minutes before heading back to my house. We waited for about 2 minutes when we saw those damn headlights coming in our direction. I couldn't believe it. The truck driver must have seen us turn down this road. I thought for sure we had lost him. The massive truck seemingly blocked our only way out. It came to a full stop. We then heard the driver's side door opening. Soon the driver was illuminated by his own headlights. This man looked huge. "What the hell should we do, Mark? You're the one who got us into this. What do you think we should do? Let's get the out of here." "I don't think I have enough room to get around him." "No, that's not true. On the left, there's a clearing. He's not hauling a trailer, so if you floor it now, you should have just enough room to get around him." I decided to trust Mark and stepped on the gas pedal. I narrowly missed hitting the man. I remember him angrily shouting at us as we zoomed past. Who knows what he would have done if he got his hands on any one of us. Mark turned out to be correct. I had just enough room to make it out of there, and I floored it all the way back home. My parents were at the casino that night, and they weren't going to be home for at least a few more hours. We locked all the doors and closed the curtains, checking every couple of minutes for any headlights. When we were convinced that we were no longer in danger, we all had a good laugh about the whole situation. It was crazy. I told Mark he's no longer allowed to eat chicken nuggets again. I'm glad we all made it out of there safely. But I'll never forget the fear I felt when I was staring down those headlights on that dark road.
About 5 years ago, I was driving back home from work late one night. I worked at a restaurant/bar at the time and often worked very late. So it was past midnight when I was finally going home and driving my Honda Accord. I lived with my parents during this time in a neighborhood about 10 minutes from my job. So after leaving work, I got onto the roads, which were very quiet, as they often were in the late night hours. It was a huge difference from when I would go to work and there would be lots of cars on the road, to when I would drive home and there would be basically nobody. So within probably 2 or 3 minutes of driving home, I did notice a car behind me. When it started following me though, I had no idea. I kept driving home and was realizing that the car behind me was turning wherever I did. Soon, I was very suspicious that I was being followed. I was never quite 100% sure though. I thought maybe it was a neighbor or something. There are many other houses in the neighborhood. Still, I was suspicious by it. Soon, I had made it to the street where my parents' house was. I turned onto it, and the car behind me did the same. I actually thought about driving around the block or turning around, but ultimately, I drove to my house and pulled into the driveway. I remember being really nervous as I was pulling in that the car would as well, but it didn't. Instead, the car kept going down the street. I felt much better, and then got out of my car and walked inside. By now, my parents and sister had long gone to bed upstairs. The lights were off inside the house, and it was very quiet. I went into the kitchen to make some ramen noodles or something like that. I was very hungry and wanted something quick to have before bed. As I was waiting for the water to heat up though, I casually walked around a little. I went into the living room and glanced out the front window. That's when I noticed a car driving extremely slow down the street. And I further noticed that it was the same car that had seemingly followed me all the way home. Now I was very suspicious. I continued to watch out the window. The car then turned and parked on the side of the street just past our house. I heard the engine turn off and then watched the driver's door open and saw a man get out. He then started walking towards our front yard. That's when I jumped back from the window so that he wouldn't see me. I went back into the kitchen and just hoped that this guy wasn't going to try to break in or something. Seconds later though, there was a knock at the front door. My heart started racing. What could this guy possibly want? Several moments went by and he knocked again. I slowly walked into the living room and went to a window. When I looked outside, I saw the man walking away from the front door, but he wasn't going back to his car. Instead, he walked around the side of our house. I went back into the kitchen and looked out of a back window. I was very careful when I was looking so that I wouldn't be seen. The man appeared to walk through the backyard. He made his way through the backyard and then went out of sight again. I then went back to the front of the house. When I looked out of the window, I didn't see the guy for a while. Soon though, I saw him going through the front yard. He went back to his car, then got inside. Then he drove away. After that, I went back to what I was doing. I looked out of the window a few more times that night, but he didn't come back. I still wonder who he was, why he followed me home, and what he was doing.
Back when I was 18 years old, for about 6 months, my boss drove me to work. I know that may sound a little weird, but I didn't get a license yet, and he knew my mom. It also helped that he lived about 2 minutes from my house. It was just a weird situation, and no matter how I try to preface it, I just know that it sounds weird. Most mornings, the drive to work was uneventful. We'd usually get to work at around 6:30 a.m., and neither one of us would talk in the car. He was usually hungover, and I just wasn't the talkative type. I'm a quiet person by nature, but I was even quieter back then. One day, we had to go to work at 3 in the morning for inventory. My boss decided it would be good to show me, so I got up extra early for that 3 a.m. shift. On the way into work that morning, my boss said that he wanted to grab some coffee at the gas station since it was the only place that was open. When we parked, as he was getting out of the car, he told me that he was going to hit the restroom as well. I just nodded and decided to wait in the car. I was exhausted from staying up way too late playing video games, and I was planning on just resting my eyes until we got to work. I'm assuming a few minutes had passed. I don't know exactly how long it was because I was falling asleep while I was waiting for my boss. With no notice, the back seat door opened, and it startled me in my half-asleep state. I just thought it was my boss, and then I felt movement behind me. I finally looked behind me, and just sitting there in the back seat was a woman. She didn't appear to be homeless or look like she was on anything. She just looked strange. And we made eye contact for a few seconds, and then I whipped back around trying to process what was happening. I'm a really quiet person, and I was even more quiet back then, like I said, and I didn't know what to say or what to do. I was just hoping my boss was going to come back out soon. I started to finally work up the courage to ask what was going on, and I was immediately freaked out when I turned around. She was sitting there, now smiling, but looking forward. I don't really know how to describe her eyes. They were cold and dark and seemed almost lifeless, even though she was kind of pretty. Even as I write this, I still can't get the image of her out of my mind. It had probably been about 30 seconds since all this started, and I finally uttered my words when I asked her, "Hey, is everything okay? You know this isn't your car, right?" Instead of answering with words, she just started to scream erratically. It was so erratic that it was shaking the entire car, it felt like, or maybe just my head. I jumped back just out of panic, confusion, and shock, and I saw my boss walking out of the gas station. I just dove out of the passenger side door and shut it behind me. My boss was confused and asked me what the heck was going on, and I just pointed to the woman in the back seat of his car. We both just stood there, almost in amazement and disbelief. She was still screaming, shaking and rocking back and forth. We could physically see the car shaking from her wild movements from inside the car. My boss approached the back seat where she was sitting, and as he grabbed the door handle, she put both her hands on the window, and I kid you not, started to hiss and growl at my boss. He said, "Nope," and walked back towards me. I was standing probably 10 feet away at this point. He immediately called the police, and we were hoping that they would arrive soon since it was a small town. The entire time that we were waiting for the cops, we could hear the woman screaming and the car still shaking. After a minute or two of waiting for the police, we went inside and watched her from inside the gas station. There was just something unsettling about the entire situation. She wasn't trying to rob us. She only looked like she wanted to cause harm when we got near the car. I mean, she was sitting in the back seat, so she wasn't even trying to steal the car. It was just all so weird. The cops showed up maybe 5 minutes after the call. We went outside to greet the officer and fill him in on the situation, and he looked confused, and I'm not going to lie, he almost looked kind of amused by the whole situation. The officer tried to get the woman to come out calmly, but after a minute of her screaming and growling, he basically went into the car and apprehended her. And this is where this bad dream truly turned into a nightmare. Upon arrest, the officer had to remove 4 knives from her person. Yeah, you heard that right. This woman had 4 sharp objects on her. Thankfully, she never showed us the knives or even hinted at the fact that she had them. But even more disturbing perhaps is the fact that she didn't have an ID on her and she wasn't talking, so the officer had no idea who she was. This complete stranger came out of nowhere. She got into my boss's car without saying a word. She went from smiling to off-the-wall insane. Then, to cap things off, she had no ID and 4 deadly weapons on her. I've had some wild things happen to me over the years, but I'd have to say that this was probably the strangest and most terrifying that's ever happened to me. It's been years, and I remember this moment like it was yesterday. I'll never forget that woman's face, and I honestly wonder what she's up to now.
My name is Danny, and this happened to me when I was living with my dad at the time of this story. My dad worked 2 jobs, and I was only 18 at the time and was a part-time college student, so my dad would oftentimes be called into work while I was either at home or school. This particular night, my dad had been called into work for one of his jobs for a possible storm emergency and wouldn't be back until the next day. This was during hurricane season, so him getting called into work wasn't too big of a surprise. Anyway, my dad had already left for work and I was laying on the couch watching a movie while somewhat enjoying the sound of rain and thunder from outside. At one point during the movie, I for some reason fell asleep and woke up to the sound of the home phone ringing. This wasn't too sketchy as we get calls almost every day, most of the time either from scammers or people looking for my dad through his work. I hesitated and got up to answer the phone and said hello, still in my drowsy state. However, the only thing I heard was a slight static from the other end of the line. The rest was just silence. Just as I was about to hang up the phone, I then heard what sounded like faint crying. I said hello one more time into the phone, and this time I got a response. There was a girl on the other end that sounded around 5 or 6 judging by her voice. She sounded distressed and scared. Then, clear as day, I heard these exact words. "Help me. I've been taken. I've been missing for 3 years." I told her to stay on the line with me and then I dialed 911 from my iPhone. All I told the operator was just to listen. I asked the girl where she was located, but with her being so young, she could only describe the house to be small and white. She explained that she was in a dark room left alone, All of a sudden, the sound of a door opening with force broke the silence and the girl began to scream before hanging up. The operator took down every little detail she tried giving us and thanked me for informing her. All the while, I was texting my dad about the situation and he told me to stay calm and call the cops again and give our address for further explanation. The cops did end up coming to my house and I was being questioned for about half an hour before they finally left. The police never did find out who that little girl was or where she was calling from, as it would have been very difficult to trace, but they did all they could. My heart aches for that child, and I hope she's doing alright, but I still have my doubts about that. About 6 years ago, something happened to me while I was home alone that I'll never forget. Because of this, I had to get therapy for 5 months straight, and this is why I will never stay home alone again. I was 12 years old at the time of this story, and this took place in my hometown in Weymouth, Massachusetts. It's a very small town, as there was nothing to do, and the antique design of the town made it look also boring and old. One weekend, my mom had told me that she had recently gotten a call back from a job that she applied to, and that she had to go into Boston for an interview. She trusted me to watch over the house for a few hours while she was gone. With me being only 12, she went over the rules most parents tell their children when being left alone. Don't go outside, don't answer the door for anybody, etc. She then left in a hurry, and I had the house to myself for a few hours until she got back. With nothing to really do or anywhere to go, I simply threw myself onto my bed and flipped on my TV to the cartoons. About an hour later, I go downstairs while on my way to the kitchen, and I notice somebody standing in our backyard. He was facing off in the opposite direction with both of his hands in his pockets as if he were waiting for the bus. At first, I didn't get too worried as a few men had been coming by to fix a pipe on the side of the house that had a major leak. However, this guy looked nothing like a plumber or anyone who specializes in repairing pipes for that matter. He wore a black long-sleeved shirt, black pants, and a gray hoodie that surely covered most of his face. I don't even remember thinking twice about it. Anyway, I had went back upstairs and finished up my TV shows and decided to go take a shower as I had a birthday to go to later that night. I turn on the shower and go in for about 15 minutes. I take really long showers, so whenever I'm home alone, I go mental. After I was done, I turned off the water, and that's when I hear the front door open. My first thought was that it was my mom finally home from her interview, so I shoot her a text asking if she was home, and within a minute, she replies with, "Hey honey, I just got finished with the interview. I'm driving home now. Is everything okay?" That's when I get a sharp pain into the pit of my stomach, knowing that someone was in my house, and it wasn't my mom. Why my dad isn't home is another story, but I take a deep breath to compose myself and wrap a towel around me and slowly creep down the steps and try and see who it was. Looking back, that was probably the most stupidest decision of my life. As I reached the bottom step, I peeked around the corner and felt my blood run cold. There was a man, about 6'6", and looked to be in his mid-30s standing in my kitchen. He was holding a large wrench in his hand and was looking directly at me as if he knew I was coming down the stairs. Then, very quietly, he said 5 words that still haunt me till this day. "Run while you still can." That's when I lost it and started screaming while running up the stairs and into my room while locking the door. All the while, I began hearing footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping at my door. I knew he was there because I could see the outlines of his shoes at the bottom of the doorframe. He began banging on the door loudly with a wrench, demanding me to let him in. At this point, calling the police wasn't an option, so I did the only thing I could do. I slowly opened my window and jumped out onto the patio floor. Even though I tried to break my fall, I still landed with some minor injuries. I felt as if 1,000 pounds had been lifted off of me when I see my mom's car pull into the driveway. I run crying to her, explaining the situation, and she immediately takes out her .45 she keeps in her purse and walks into the house. I'd like to mention that my mom had served 3 years in the military, so she knew what she was doing. I heard 2 very loud gunshots from inside my room, followed by yelling and screaming. Police had been called by my neighbors, who apparently had heard the gunshots, and police then took this nightmare guy away. The look the man gave me as he was forced into the backseat of the police car was something that I'd never forget. It was a look of pure hatred and anger, like the first thing he would do once he got out of jail would be to come back for me. We had since moved out of that house a month later due to the constant paranoia I was having, which eventually made me have mental therapy as previously mentioned before. I don't know what the man's intentions were, but if he had a wrench with him, chances are he was probably planning on doing a lot more than just robbing us.
This happened on my 23rd birthday. I'm now 45. I live in Michigan, and this happened early January. I was prepping for a night out with my girl and cleaning up since we normally have parties at my house. My son was home since I was dropping him off on our way out. He was 4 at the time, and I was a single mom. I went to take out my trash, and I'd left my door open a small crack since I was heading out soon. Big mistake. Keep in mind, this was not the best area. I had then heard my son say, "Mom, someone's here." That alone caught my attention, just his voice sounded odd. I looked, and I saw a man who had a mask on and a dark hoodie. He then yells, "I got a gun! Give me your money!" I had literally just got paid on this day, so my first thought was to distract him. My purse was in my dining room downstairs, but I told him it was upstairs. I lived in a townhouse at the time. He grabbed me by my shirt and ripped off my chain. Well, that pissed me off, and at this point I had not seen a gun, so I said, which looking back was a terrible idea. We fought, and he got some good blows on me, but so did I. My son was now screaming and crying at this point. My front door was still open, so I pushed him as hard as I could, and he literally went flying out the door down my front stairs. I then ran outside just screaming and yelling for help. A cop happened to drive by, and he asked what was going on, so I told him, and he took off. It was winter, so they tracked him down and caught him. He went to jail, but he didn't really do any serious time. He was released about a year later. I was walking into a grocery store when I had seen him. My heart stopped, and I immediately grabbed my son and walked out. I followed up with the court, and they claimed that they had sent me a notice, but I never got it. About 6 months later, he was on the front page of the local newspaper as he had killed someone, and he's now serving 55 years. If they would have put him away for what he did to my son and I, a life might have actually been saved. I do still check on him occasionally just to make sure he's still locked up. I was street smart, but this put me on edge for years. I would sleep with a knife in my front door until I met my husband, who finally allowed me to relax and trust again. I'm still so grateful to him. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my story, and please stay safe. The story happened almost 15 years ago when I was about 4 years old, and although this occurred when I was quite young, the images from this experience are permanently planted in my mind, but a few of the details are hazy. Now, to give some background, my family and I lived in a nice suburban neighborhood about an hour outside of Chicago. On this particular day, I would be in the care of my then 15-year-old sister and her best friend, while my mother would be running the store. She gave us the normal safety talk and made it clear we were to not go outside. She then departed to the store, and my sister and her friend, not even 5 minutes later, suggested we go on a walk around the neighborhood. I remember distinctly my sister then opening the garage door, seating me in my bright pink kid's Jeep, and we began our walk around the neighborhood. We lived in a cul-de-sac and primarily retired community kind of neighborhood. We began going around the block, my sister and her friend having a blast and rebellious behavior as they saw it. Now, I remember that we then turned the street and continued through the neighborhood. We made it about a quarter up the street when we then saw an older woman walking towards us about a football field length in front of us. We all stopped dead in our tracks. She was wearing a long tan coat. My sister and friend gave each other a look, and we sat stagnant there in place. The woman then being ahead of us held all three of our young girls' attention. After only a few seconds since noticing her, she then realized that we saw her in turn. Within less than a minute of catching her gaze, she then began charging us, yelling at us down the sidewalk. My sister grabbed my pink Jeep and her friend, and then held me in her arms as we ran through backyards being chased by this woman. We made it to our backyard, and we ran inside our back French doors as quickly as we could, immediately locking the set as we scrambled inside. We then heard a bang. We all then turned to see a large man, tall, broad shoulders and built, leaning against the back door staring at us, looking upset that we had locked the door. This is the point in time that my memory turns hazy. I don't really remember what happened after, but I do remember my sister calling the cops and my mom returning home and scolding my sister and her friend for calling the cops, saying they were teenage girls and just liked to start drama. This happened over a decade ago, and we to this day never know what happened to those two, as there were no arrests ever made. My sister and I are still close, yet we haven't talked about this experience in years. I can't forget the vivid memory I have of being chased and genuinely thinking we were doomed if that door hadn't been locked just in time. Dear God, was that a terrifying experience. My friends and I decided to have a sleepover at my house since my parents were gone. This story took place over 10 years ago. My mom told me she would be going to Mexico to visit some family members that were sick. She wanted me to stay and feed and take care of the dogs, so I agreed. She told me she would be leaving Friday night and would most likely be back on Monday. Since I was 14 at the time, of course, I was happy to have the house free of adults, even for a few days. On Friday, she left me money, and she told me she ordered a pizza and to tip the driver. She left it around 6, and the pizza got there around 7. I tipped the driver, and he left. Around 8 p.m., I decided to call my friends to see if they were trying to hang out, as I didn't want to be by myself that whole weekend. My friends, who we'll call Omar and Lewis, had agreed. We all kind of lived in the same neighborhood, so they had biked to my house. They got there around 8:30 and we were just playing 2K and Call of Duty together, like most teenagers do. We had stopped playing around 11 and we were getting kind of bored, so we had watched a scary movie. I had told them to pick a movie while I went and put some popcorn in the microwave. While I was putting the popcorn in the microwave, I had heard a big bang in my backyard, like something hit our fence. Now, my kitchen is at the back of the house, and there's 2 big windows in the back, so if something was there, it for sure would have seen me. I thought it was probably my dogs just in the backyard, so I just shrugged it off and we watched the movie. Mid-movie, we then hear knocking at my front door. This startles us, so I decide to go see who it was. Well, I go to the door, and I see a girl no older than 19, and she starts banging on my door telling me to open it. I then hear her asking for help, saying to open the door and that something's after her. As you can all imagine, my friends and I are scared shitless right now. Lewis decides to run over to open the door to help her, but when he does, she pushes the door open and knocks him down, and then 2 other guys come right in behind her. When this happened, I knew right then that they were going to rob us. That's when Omar and I run up the stairs, which was probably the dumbest thing we could have done. Lewis got up there quickly and had followed us, and the girl followed us too. The 2 guys stayed and tried to steal anything they saw, including my Xbox. Omar and I ran up to the attic, but Lewis was a little chubby, so he didn't quite make it, and he just ran into my room and then put his body against the door. Luckily, the girl didn't see us run into the attic, but I think she did see Lewis run into the room, so she probably assumed we were in there too. She was pounding on the door, when suddenly Lewis just opened it and then tackled her. Lewis then started jumping on her, and that's when Omar and I decided to join in. I'd started to yell that I called the cops and they're on the way. The guys run out, and then Lewis gets off of her and she joins them. They ended up leaving, and we decided not to tell anyone what happened, as they really only stole the Xbox and nothing else. We couldn't really get any sleep for the rest of the night, but we were really happy that we scared them off. I'm really grateful that all of us ended up being okay, and that it didn't get worse than what it was. Last year, I moved to another city after finishing high school. I assessed several college options, and I decided on one that would have me move roughly 3 hours. I found an apartment where I would be able to live without roommates, and it was in a safe part of town with a reasonable rent. It was close to some attractions in the city, which was an added bonus to me, as it would still allow me to have a reasonable social life. For the first 4 months or so, it was great. There were absolutely no problems or safety concerns of any sort, and I managed to become good friends with a guy who studied at the same college as me. He coincidentally lived around 5 minutes away from me, so we would often hang out at each other's places. One night, just as winter started, he had called me over to play some video games and hang out. We had a pretty chill night, drank a few beers and had a few good laughs and enjoyed ourselves. At around 1 a.m., we decided to call it a wrap, and I headed home to my apartment. When I got back home, I decided to head out to the balcony that overlooked the entrance of my building to go smoke a cigarette. I vividly remember looking around and seeing absolutely nobody. It was a cold winter night, and it wasn't the weekend, so understandably everybody was at home. Besides the usual car or two passing by, it was dead quiet. Once I finished my cigarette, I decided to call it a night and get ready for bed. I was understandably confused when I had heard a short ring on my doorbell. I stood in the center of my room for a solid few seconds as confusion and a little bit of fear then set in. I snapped out of it and decided to tiptoe to my door just to try and hear if anyone was outside. My immediate thought was that my friend came over to drop something off that I might have forgotten. But then I thought to myself that he would have texted me or called. I probably listened for half a minute or so when the person once again rang the doorbell and then softly knocked a few times. I was stood still, and I didn't want to make a sound so that I wouldn't give away the fact that I was at the door. I heard the stranger pacing around the apartment for a few seconds before he then stopped. I then waited for any sort of noise, but it was quiet. That's when I decided to look at the peephole to see that he had hopefully left. I picked up the cover of the peephole and then took a look. My legs pretty much went numb as I saw a hooded figure looking straight into the peephole. He was holding the zipper of his hoodie so as to hide his face. All I could really make out was his forehead and eyes. He must have either heard me lift the cover or my heavy breathing, because right away he moved from the peephole and then said, "I know you're at the door." Now, by this point, I was pretty much shivering in fear, but I had mustered up the courage to then say, "I'm calling the cops, man." To which he then laughed and said, "Yeah, sure thing, big guy." He then proceeded to wipe away the door handle with his sleeve before then walking off. I understandably called the police. When they came over, they had actually informed me that I wasn't the only one. He had been doing this for at least a month, and they also suspected him of at least one home invasion where a father had to chase him out of the house. I crashed in my friend's house for around a week or so after this before I felt comfortable going back into my own apartment. It's been a year, and I haven't heard any new news about him. He could have been arrested by now, but as far as I know, he hasn't been. I find it more than likely that he simply just moved to a different area. I'm not sure if he had any violent intent or not, but either way, let's seriously never see each other again.